to start. Party. Hey, hey. All right, and I am, so this is a class on TREC contracts, and we're letting everybody in right now. We're really going to be going over the 1 to 4 family contract is the main thing that we're going to be going over, and the changes that are happening in 2021. But rather than just going over those pieces, we're going to go over it a little more broadly, because I think when you just pull out those pieces, it starts to not, it's just not a great overall review. So we're going to do the overall review, but we're going to really focus on those changes and make sure those are good too. So to start, I'm going to put in the chat box well, almost all of the information. I'm actually going to pull that one out. Okay, there are links to all of the forms that I'm going to be using. So if you want to go out and pull those forms so that way you can either print them and make notes on them, or you can just take notes and have those on your screen next to you, however you want to do it. I am going to screen share so that you can see which ones I'm talking about. But it's always, I'm a person who really loves to take notes myself. So that's why I always want to give y'all the option for that too. All right. Does anybody have any questions before we start about anything or anything y'all need? Okay, then I am going to, and we're just going to jump in then and start going over the 1 to 4 family residential contract for resale in the draft form that is set to go live April 1st. So these are what TREC has said is that they are going to make these available in the month of February after their commission meeting. And so at that point, likely there will be a day when you'll go into zip forms and it will just be the new form. And that should be on zip forms. That'll be on transaction desk, wherever you're getting your forms. I will encourage you to, if you're not using zip forms right now, you're using a different platform, this might be a great time to say, you know what, I think I'm going to go ahead and give zip forms a chance, because just know from the brokerage perspective, that's where we're supporting and where we're making all the changes and really hoping to make sure that those templates are ready to go for you so that you've got great starting place for that. Okay. So starting up at the top on the 1 to 4 family residential contract, you'll see these dates up in the top. And I don't know if y'all can see where I'm highlighting forms, hopefully, yes. Actually, I'm gonna, hold on, change so I can see a few more, y'all. Okay, so up in the top right-hand corner, it's gonna have the new date for 11/10/2020. So the old form date was 2/12/18. So if you see, when you're working on these and you're not sure if you're in the right form or not, that's how you go and check to make sure, hey, I'm in the right form or I'm not. Again, there's going to be some optional time period in that February to April 1st, but as of April 1st, no more use of the old form. If you use the old form, then you could be, I guess, brought up on charges with TREC or something, go to TREC jail. So it's not like you're going to necessarily go to court immediately, but it's something that we want to make sure is right on that. Okay, so starting with parties, y'all know parties to the contract. We want to make sure we fill out as accurately there as possible. If you're representing the buyer, which the buyer's agent is most of the time the one who's going to be filling out the offer. And so if you're representing the buyer, make sure to get the right seller name before you submit the offer for your buyer for signature. You can check tax records, you can check the seller's disclosure. There's a lot of different ways to check to make sure that you've got the right seller names in there from the very beginning. Same thing from the buyer's perspective. You want to make sure the right buyer names are in there from the beginning. And I usually match that to my pre-qual letter just to make sure that that's exactly what the lender wanted to have from a buyer name perspective. However middle initial or full middle name, whatever they have on there, just make sure that that's matching either prior title or for the seller or what this buyer is going to have on the loan going forward. Good on that? Okay, moving down into property. This is where we start to see a few changes with the 2021 form. Not huge amount of changes, but y'all know I love paragraph 2. Y'all, I'm just like a huge geek for the contract in general, but I love paragraph 2 because this is really where really enumerates what exactly the seller is selling to the buyer. And it is so helpful to go through and really read to make sure that you know what the seller is conveying so that you can best represent either party and know, hey, yes, that's included, or no, that's not included. There should be no doubts in it because it is very clear in this black and white, hey, this is included and this is not. Okay. I know a lot of times we go by that attachment test and we say, well, if it's screwed in the wall, then that's staying. And if it's not, and that is true for a lot of things, but we're getting into a world, especially more as we move into more technological like things in the house, right? Smart home features and all these, that it's not so much just the screw in the wall test anymore. It really is. There are some different things of what we need to be looking at. Okay, so first part of paragraph 2 is paragraph A, and that's going to be the land. That'll be where you put in your lot and block. If you're dealing with a property that is not a lot and block, then you can do an attached exhibit. That's totally cool, just to make sure that it is really defined. Because does the contract sell based on address or on what's in paragraph 2A? Right, 2A. So the address does not matter. The address is really just something that the post office uses and FedEx uses to know where to drop off mail. Paragraph 2A is what defines what property is being sold. So we've really got to make sure that paragraph 2A is correct. All right, then improvements. So we are selling the house, garage, and all other fixtures and improvements attached to the above described real property, including without limitation the following permanently installed and built-in items. And they have that bolded, which y'all know when it's bolded, that's like Jesus talking in the contract, right? We've got to really pay attention to it. And that it's, so these are the things that are like somehow permanently put into the property. And so it's going to be all equipment and appliances, valances, screens, shutters, awnings, wall-to-wall carpeting, mirrors, ceiling fans, attic fans, mailboxes, television antennas, mounts and brackets for televisions and speakers, heating and conditioning units, security and fire detection equipment, wiring, plumbing and lighting fixtures, chandeliers, water softener system, kitchen equipment, garage door openers, cleaning equipment, shrubbery, landscaping, outdoor cooking equipment, and all other property attached to the above described real property. Oh, it's a lot in there, right? And so if you ever question like what is really supposed to be included, go back and read this. And y'all, I know it sounds like this class is kind of me reading to you in a lot of portions. And I know that can be really redundant and like, oh my gosh, like I gotta listen to Amy read the contract again. But y'all, when you call me and say, hey, the seller has this antenna and it's not really attached, it's like sitting on the mantle, I'm not really sure if that's included or not. I come back and just read you paragraph 2 and say, well, that antenna, if it was permanently attached, yes, it would go. But if you're saying it's not permanently attached, it's just like with an HDMI cable into the TV, then no, it's not. And so we just go through and really look at all of those. Were there any of those that were surprises on there? You were like, I did not know that was part of paragraph 2. No surprises. Okay. Well, that's good. Then y'all really know the contract. So you can just log off now. You're good. But I mean, I will tell you, for me, it is always just going back and looking at it and really saying what passes the test, what is permanently installed, what is not, and how does that make sense going forward. The change that they made in the new 2021 contract is that they took out that line owned by seller. Okay. And so this is saying, hey, if it's attached, the thought is that the seller is going to assume that it is owned unless you provide a lease to show that it is leased. Okay. So where could this be a problem, right? This could be a problem with, let's say, a water softener system that they have installed, and it's this giant thing in the garage and it goes all through the house. And the buyer, when they walk through the house, they're like, okay, cool, permanently installed. That meets the test of paragraph number 2. But if they don't, and they assume that the seller owns it, But if the seller doesn't own it, they should have either had it removed prior to listing it, or they're going to need to include a copy of the lease with the offer so that we can know that, hey, that is actually not owned. You are going to have a lease payment in order to continue to receive the benefit of that. Okay. So that whole thing, that's a big part of the changes that are happening in 2021. And we're going to get deeper into that with the addendum for fixture leases. Just know this is the first little part where it's indicating, hey, there's a change regarding those big things that are installed in the house. All right, let's look at paragraph C, accessories. And there's some changes on 2021 here too. The following described related accessories, if any: window air conditioning units, stove, fireplace screens, curtains and rods, blinds, window shades, draperies and rods, door keys, mailbox keys, above ground pool, swimming pool equipment and maintenance accessories, artificial fireplace logs, security systems that are not fixtures, and controls for garage doors, entry gates, and other improvements and accessories. Then it goes to define what controls are, and it says controls include sellers' transferable rights to the software and applications used to access and control improvements or accessories, and hardware used solely to control improvements or accessories. Okay, so what does all that mean? So keep in mind, all of this section C, there is no attachment that is needed in order for this to be a part of it, right? So if there's logs in the fireplace, right, they're not going to be screwed in order to be deemed that those are with the house. They are just, if they are in there and that's an accessory to the house, that is staying with the house. Same thing as curtains and rods and all those things, but also fireplace screens, y'all. I talk about this a lot. To me, this is, well, it was one of the biggest litigated items in the state of Texas regarding the TREC contract. And it was because there was a giant fireplace screen that was deemed as the seller to be art and as the buyer to be deemed an accessory to the house. Now, who won that? Is it an accessory to the house, or is it art because it's freestanding?
Accessory to the house.
Buyer gets it.
Yeah, the buyer gets it. It's an accessory to the house. And so even though that seller had commissioned it and paid thousands and thousands of dollars to have this giant fireplace screen that was freestanding in front of this like palatial fireplace, it still goes with the buyer. And so luckily, most of the time for me anyway, if we're talking about something that's a fireplace screen freestanding, it's something that was bought at Target. So it's not like it's that big a deal one way or the other who gets it. But in order for me not to be buying a fireplace screen, I need to be clear with the seller. If you leave it there while we're showing the house and while that buyer's coming in, then it's going to be deemed an accessory. If you want it to go with you, I either need to enumerate it in paragraph D exclusions, or just go ahead and take it and pack it up, put it somewhere else at your parents' house, something, so that way there is no question that that was not supposed to be included with the house. Okay. All of this about security systems and controls. This again is starting this process of, we want to make sure that when the buyer gets the house, that they can control the smart systems that they have. Okay. That they don't, they didn't just get this house with a bunch of cameras and they don't know how to access those cameras. Okay. Or they don't know that maybe the seller still has control of those cameras. Right. And this can be things like a Ring doorbell. This can be things like a Nest. These can be things like a whole big camera system or a whole big smart home system. Like there's a lot of different metrics on how far this can go. Where it's saying that any dedicated controls would go is that if it's not an app, so like Ring doorbell, that's going to be controlled with an app, right? There's not like a Ring doorbell remote control or something like that. And so if the buyer gets the house, the Ring doorbell goes with it, and they're going to get whatever app that was needed to go with it. There may not be any cost or anything like that to get that, so it's not a big deal. But if there is something that was like a specific video control panel or something like that, then that would go with the buyer because it was just meant to control the Control 4 system or whatever that is. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay, it's fairly clear. It's just, it's kind of surprising that we didn't have this already in the contract. I think it was just something that was happening a lot of times that, you know, of course the seller would leave the whatever to control, but now it's really getting specific and saying, hey, anything that was used to control that system is going to stay with the house. All right, section D, exclusions. The following improvements and accessories will be retained by seller and must be removed prior to delivery of possession. Okay, so y'all know anything in paragraph B or C that the seller wants to keep, that's where we would put those things in. Okay, what if the seller wants to keep a piano? I can't remember who has this deal going right now, but the listing agent was insistent that piano be put in there. Are they right or wrong?
I would say they were wrong.
I love it, Brady. Thank you for participating. Yay.
Yes.
Yeah. So really it's wrong. It should not be in there. And it's really breaching your responsibility as an agent to fill out the form correctly by putting it in there. And so TREC could come back and say, hey, this should have never been in here. It was very clear in paragraph B and C that that was not supposed, that was never going to be included. And so by putting it in there, it created confusion and redundancy to the consumer. You didn't do your job well. Hey, we're going to fine you this much money or whatever. So it's not, you know, is that really going to happen? Probably not. Probably not. TREC jail is going to come and get you for some of this stuff. But it really is not good to put anything that is personal property in there, or anything, or something that is dealt with in another form, which what's our big thing on that? Minerals. Okay.
Yes.
Don't ever put minerals in paragraph D. They tried to make it very clear there and say in paragraph E, a whole line just to say, please don't put minerals in D, because reservations for oil, gas, and other minerals, water, timber, or other interests made in accordance with another attached addendum, not here. Okay. So this really is things like chandelier, fireplace screens, maybe, you know, the tulip bulbs the garden because they remind them of mom, stuff like that, that can go there. But anything that is really a personal property just should not. Now, if there was some sort of question of like, well, is that personal property? Are they planning on taking it? We're not sure. Then really that would be best dealt with outside of the contract, just making sure to confirm, hey, we deem this, whatever it is, to be personal property. We just want to make sure that that is the way that it is. So like, in my opinion, the listing agent on that one that said piano, they would have just put in private remarks, seller to remove piano prior to possession or something like that. And that would have been better than putting it into paragraph 2D. Cool. Any questions on paragraph 2 in general? Like I said, it's one of my favorites, so I'm always willing to talk about paragraph 2. And don't be afraid to pull it out and read it to a consumer. Don't be afraid to pull it out and you read it. Like y'all, this one is, there is so much in it, packed in it, that you may need. So don't be afraid to go back to it. All right. Yeah. Oh, Amanda, I can't hear you. Can you get closer to your mic or something?
Yes. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. Just clarification on the piano thing. You don't put that in excludes?
No, because it's personal property. It's like furniture, something that's not, it is not permanently installed and built in, and it's not.
And financium is by the.
Huh?
It's not, it's personal property. So it's not permanently installed or built in, and it's also not an accessory in that list of accessories.
So as long as you exclude it in private remarks and then you verbally let people know.
You really don't need to do that. It's just already deemed. I mean, anything that, you know, because you get down a slippery slope, right? You know, if you've got to really go through and put down every personal property that's excluded, like it's overkill. But if you've got a seller that's like super anxious and the only thing in the house is the refrigerator, let's say, or the piano, whatever, and they just want to be really clear that that's not going with the house, they could put it in private remarks.
Okay.
Amy?
Yeah, Jerome.
Yes. So what if What if the buyer wants to buy the furniture? Is there a form for that?
Yes, there is. Great
Okay.
question. It is the non-realty items addendum, and I actually don't have that in here today, but we can just pull it up real quick since you asked about it.
Nice.
Hold on, non-realty items addendum. It's a really easy form to use. I use it all the time. Can y'all see that now? Is that coming up on the screen? Non-realty items addendum. Okay. It's a really easy form to use, and you can just detail out whatever that is that you want to have included. So let's say that the seller wants to give the buyer the refrigerator that's in the house. This would be perfect to use, and just say for an additional sum of usually $0, additional sum of $0, the stainless steel refrigerator located in the kitchen is going to convey to the buyer. You do want it to be as detailed as possible on this form so that they don't, like if you just say refrigerator and then they take out the really nice, pretty side-by-side stainless refrigerator and throw in like a cheapo, like it looks like a garage refrigerator into the kitchen. I just always want to be as clear as possible to make sure that everybody knows exactly what is being conveyed.
Yes, I've seen a bad fight over which fridge.
Yeah, not real fun.
No, it's not fun at all. And it's stupid because everybody knows it was the kitchen refrigerator, but you've got to be really specific about that one.
A lot of times I'll say stainless steel side-by-side refrigerator located in kitchen 12521.
Right.
That way, then it's clear, like when we saw the house, that's the one that I want. It's hard to pull like a SKU or, some sort of like number off of the fridge or something like, or any of that. But that way, then it is clear. A lot of times I'll take a picture of it while we're in the house, just so that way it's clear, like this is the one. I may not attach the picture here, but just for my records, I've got something that shows what was in the house at that time. And I will tell you too, there's a lot of times in all of this paragraph 2 is that I'm going back to the pictures of the house and like kind of looking through to see what's there, whether I'm representing the seller or the buyer. And I want to really make sure that everybody's on the same page. Like, is that TV that's hung on the wall, is that mount staying? Are the drapes that are in the little girl's room that match the baby's bedspread or something like that, is that staying? Just want to really make sure that everybody's clear, because that's where feelings get hurt here. Usually it's not over a lot of money or a lot of stuff. It's just that people don't understand what they were conveying.
What if there are things that the seller is leaving in the house that the buyer wants them to take out of the house? Where do you?
So that's where you would handle that off contract, because the non-realty would be things that are left in the house, but otherwise the seller is supposed to remove items from the house. And that would be in this paragraph 9. Yeah, closing, where it says that the property is like being moved over. I will tell you the TREC contract is pretty silent to condition of the home being transferred. So like how clean it's supposed to be or how cleaned out it's supposed to be. You would want to be very specific about anything that needs to be removed. You could also include it into this paragraph with the repairs. Where did they move that? That's in 7D. Yeah, 7D, this acceptance of property condition. You could say buyer accepts the property as is, except that we want the shed knocked down in the backyard and all items removed, or we want the refrigerator that's in the kitchen removed, something like that. But otherwise, you're kind of deemed to like whatever the seller leaves, you get. Good question. Anything else on paragraph 2? All right. Let's move on to paragraph 3, sales price. All right, so sales price. The cash portion of the sales price payable to buyer at closing is the first line on there. And then sum of all finance described in the attached, either third-party financing addendum, loan assumption addendum, or seller financing addendum is the second. And then the sum of A and B is the sales price. I will tell you, I haven't seen a loan assumption addendum or a seller financing addendum, at least this year. It is pretty rare when we're using those, but they do come up from time to time. Most of the time, if you're dealing with something like that, you're going to call me and we're going to go over it. What really you need to know about is the third party financing addendum. That's really the biggest thing in here, except if there's cash. Y'all don't make it more complicated if it needs to be. If somebody's paying cash, that is a great day. And then you don't have all of the third party financing addendum stuff that goes along with it. I'm going to go ahead and go over the third party financing addendum, because it's a meaty addendum. There's a lot that goes into it. And so we want to make sure that everybody gets that one. So I'm going to pull this one up and we'll go over third party financing.
Amy, I have one quick question. Are you seeing many seller financing
No.
offers and contracts coming through? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think there may be some happening that are happening kind of without realtors involved. You know, they're the shadier deals, right, y'all? And it doesn't have to be. I mean, seller financing does not have to be shady, but it's just, I think that is why we're not seeing as much, is because they are happening, but they're happening without us being a part of it. So,
yeah.
All right, third party financing addendum, potentially the most not understood addendum in there, even though you think like this one should be pretty easy. We see it on almost every deal. It is fairly easy if you fill it out correctly, but it is just, the agents just forget how to fill it out all the time. Or you're representing the seller, you know how to fill it out, but the buyer's agent didn't really know how to fill it out, and they sent it to you and it was messed up from the very beginning, right? This form is not changing as part of the 2021 stuff, so we're not talking about anything new here. We're going to go over it fairly quickly, but I don't want you to miss how important this form is and just think that I'm not covering it. So we'll jump into any questions that you have. All right, first, read this first part that says type of financing and duty to apply and obtain approval for paragraph 1. Buyer shall apply promptly for all financing described below and make every reasonable effort to obtain approval for financing, including but not limited to furnishing all information and documents required to the buyer's lender. All right, so if you have a buyer who is mad at the seller or just whatever, doesn't want, or lender or whatever, doesn't want to provide all those things that Mike Mills asked for, he's like, that's just unreasonable. I am not doing that. I just want to get out of this contract. Well, they can't get out of the contract based on the third party financing addendum for that, okay? What this is talking about is this is saying that they are getting approval for financing. And so this first paragraph says, hey, I am going to try to get approval for this. Now, what y'all should be thinking is like, well, didn't they already do that? Isn't that why we have that pre-qual letter? Isn't that why we have that pre-approval letter already? Yes, yes, they should have already done this, but this is what is just kind of going a step further, really to explain to the consumer and to the seller, hey, the buyer is willing to do this. They're willing to go the distance with this lender and make sure that they can get approved for everything, okay? Does not say what promptly is, and so based on the timeline in paragraph 2, which we'll get into in just a minute, it could be that they let it run all the way up until the end of that, and then they apply and can't get it and try to terminate the contract. That is okay because TREC has left it so gray. I say all the time that this is the, hey, seller bend over addendum, because the seller has no rights in this. This is all about creating outs and rights for the buyer so that they can get out of the contract for financing related issues. And really, it is very easy for a buyer to get out of the contract for financing related issues because because the judge, if the seller tries to get specific performance and get the buyer to buy it, it is difficult for any lender to compel someone to get financing on a property. Okay, so cash is king. We love that. That's good. This one, not as good, but it does give the buyer some outs. And so that's what this form is all about, benefit to the buyer, not to the seller. Cool. Okay, so where I start to see agents break down and filling out this form is that they miss checking one of the boxes, A, B, C, D, E, F. Like they may fill out all the rest of it, but if you don't check which box they're going into, the form is not filled out correctly. All right, so my little screen went off. So that means after we finish this form, we're gonna get a 3-minute break. Okay. So you want to make sure you've checked A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or E, F, and then that you've also filled out the internal part of whatever section they're going for. So if I have a consumer that is getting a 30-year loan with a 3% interest rate and they're paying up to 1% origination, then I'm going to click A1, and then I'm going to say first mortgage loan amount and the amount of whatever their loan amount is, right? Excluding any finance PMI, due in full in 30 years with an interest not to exceed 3% per annum for the first 30 years, okay? Normally that's gonna match unless it's a balloon or something like that. Of the loan with origination charges as shown on the buyer's loan estimate for the loan not to exceed 1%, let's say, of the loan. Then I'm totally done with paragraph 1, the whole paragraph 1. I don't have to put anything else in there. Where if I'm the listing agent and I get that form in and I get a pre-qual for that buyer and it says they are pre-qualled at a 3.25% interest rate and you put 3% on here, what does that mean? That really means that the buyer can get out of the loan if they can't get a 3% rate. Well, the lender already said on the pre-qual they could only get a 3.25. So that's not good for my seller. If I'm the listing agent, I'm the seller, especially if I'm in a multiple offer situation, I'm going to advise the seller like, hey, this is a very weak offer because the listing agent, or sorry, the buyer's agent has created this out for the buyer based on the interest rate that they've put in here. Okay, so it is very important to make sure whatever interest rate you're putting in there, that it either matches or exceeds what is on the pre-qual letter. A lot of times our consumers will choose to put a number higher than what's on the pre-qual letter because they want their offer to be stronger. So let's say that instead of putting a 3 in there, I put a 3.5, okay? And I said, hey, as long as they can get a loan for this for 30 years for 3.5, they're qualified for 3.25, right? But as long as they can get it for 3.5, they're still gonna go forward with it. That's great for the seller, right? Because even if rates go up a little bit, the seller still has a buyer that is ready, willing, and able to buy at even a higher interest rate than what they could qualify for, right? If I've got a consumer that really wants to make their offer very strong, we might put in 6% there, okay? So this is something that it does not have to match exactly, but you need to know like where to use the throttle up or down on there. Any questions on that part? I know it's a little confusing. Okay.
Have you seen many offers, Amy, where people are putting in much larger amounts?
I have seen a few, but I don't think they're doing it on purpose. I think they're doing it because they don't understand the
Just,
form.
yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I think the more that we understand the form and we can do it correctly, it can be a really good thing. And then you can, like when you're recording your BombBomb video to the other agent, hopefully you're doing, to tell them about how great that offer is, you can explain that to the other agent too, because they may not realize that you're making the offer better for that too. Okay. So anyway, so really in this paragraph 1, just fill out whatever section you're in as completely as possible. The one thing that you may need to know is on 1C FHA insured. Normally it's section 203B. That's the normal FHA loan. If you are doing an FHA loan with renovation attached to it, that's called a 203K. It's not done very often, but that may be, but it's normally a 203B there. Everything else is pretty self-explanatory in paragraph 1. All right, then we get to paragraph 2, and it talks about approval for financing. And it says, approval for the financing described above will be deemed to have been obtained when buyer approval and property approval are obtained. And then it has in bold, time is of the essence for this paragraph and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. So that means if this says 21 days and it goes to 22, no, like there's no automatic extension. There's nothing that says that we're going to roll for reasonable circumstances. It is a hard date that ends. Okay. There's 2 paragraphs here, A and B. It's really important to kind of know the difference between the two. The first one is buyer approval. So that's like, hey, as a person, can I get approval for financing for this property? And then the second part is B, property approval. And that's saying, hey, as a little house, as a property, whatever this is, can that property get approval for financing? Okay. So from a seller perspective, they want to make sure that both of those get done. From a buyer perspective, they should be fairly confident walking into approval for them as a person, because they should have already gone down that path with their lender and made sure that they do qualify. Okay. So that's what that first one is saying is, hey, buyer approval is subject to buyer obtaining buyer approval. If buyer cannot obtain buyer approval, buyer may give written notice to seller within blank days after the effective date of this contract, and this contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If buyer does not terminate the contract under this provision, the contract will no longer be subject to the buyer obtaining buyer approval. Buyer approval will be deemed to have been obtained when, number one, the terms of the loan described above are available, and two, the lender determines that the buyer has satisfied all the lender's requirements related to buyer's assets, income, and credit history. So that is one checkbox. Or you can check the second checkbox that says this contract is not subject to buyer obtaining buyer approval. Okay. I get a lot of like concern here that like, well, I've got to put in a number of days that will get me through the appraisal. Well, no, you do not have to do that, because that's in section B. So I'm going to go ahead and read that, and then we're going to come back to A. B is property approval. If buyer's lender determines that the property does not satisfy lender's underwriting requirements for the loan, including but not limited to the appraisal, insurability, and lender required repairs, buyer not later than 3 days before the closing date, which again, remember, time is of the essence here, so they've got to know 3 days before, may terminate this contract by giving seller notice of termination and a copy of a written statement from the lender setting forth the reason or reasons for lender's determination. If buyer terminates under this paragraph, the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If buyer does not terminate under this paragraph, property approval is deemed to have been obtained. Okay, so that second section is what gives the buyer a ton of outs, because if for some reason that property does not appraise, if they can't get insurance, if there's some sort of required repairs for the lender and the seller will not agree to do it, then the buyer can get out for any of those reasons, as long as it's more than 3 days prior to the closing date. Okay, which hopefully your lenders are ordering appraisals timely, and those are coming in so that we get all that information more than 3 days prior to the close date. But that gives the buyer so much oomph, right? Because that's stuff that's out of their power. They can't do anything about the appraisal. They can't do anything about the insurability of the house. That they had no idea about. But that paragraph A, the buyer can do something about, right? The buyer kind of knows, like, do I qualify? Did I just lose my job? Or did I go and buy that car and I didn't tell anybody? Whatever. That's what that paragraph A is about. And that's to protect the seller against that guy. Well, that guy, you know, in my opinion, we should be working with clients that really understand that and have really dialed in on that, where really a lot of them should be able to check that second box that says this contract is not subject to buyer obtaining buyer approval. Okay. And I know that sounds scary, but if we're looking at making an aggressive offer, if we're looking at getting this buyer into the house, maybe they need to go ahead and not just get a pre-qual letter from a flimsy lender, but talk with one of our preferred lenders and go all the way through, getting them all the documents, getting them everything to make sure that they've got, hey, we are qualified. We are good. Up to this amount, we are good. There's nothing else that can come from it. Then check that box number 2. That's going to make your offer look a whole lot more aggressive to the seller. If not, check box number 1, but with a number of days that is reasonable for the lender to get information back to the buyer of whether they qualify or not. I mean, really, 7 days should be enough for this buyer to get all that documentation over to the lender and make sure that we're okay. I think in our base templates, it has 18 days. I'm okay with that too. You know, on a 30-day close, that definitely gives more protection to the buyer. But if we're flipping into a market where it is harder for us to get buyers under contract, just know playing around with the number of days there to bring it down, or checking that box number 2, if the buyer is okay with it and has already worked with the lender to make sure that they're okay, that's going to make your offer more cash-like so that you've got some more power there. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about the difference between A and B or the power that you've got there with the appraisal?
I don't know why I'm confused on this, but the number of days in there, if if you don't have the appraisal back and the house doesn't appraise,
That's in
then
that
does,
section B. So you really have all the way up until 3 days prior to close on that. There's no days requirement on that. So like,
okay,
let's say you had a 60-day close, right? And you didn't get the appraisal back until day 45. You still would have a full out, the buyer could get all their earnest money back. No big deal.
okay. So are you still in active contingent with that amount until those amount of days expire?
No, it's really in pending.
That's okay. The other agent keeps telling me no until the third party addendum expires.
That is true in
Okay.
A.
So I didn't know which one was correct.
Yes, he is right. It's in paragraph A, not paragraph B though. So because paragraph A, you still like the buyer can kind of get out for anything, right? Because
Okay.
they can't, because they still have to have a letter from the lender and that kind of thing. But it's like, it's more of the dude that could be the problem versus the property that could be the problem. Now, let me say one other thing about that too. So, well, let me finish that, Haley. So Haley's right. So it would be in contingent all the way up through the number of days in paragraph A, and then it would flip to pending, even though it is still contingent on the appraisal. But there are so many contingencies in there in the contract in general. There's not a way really to leave it in contingent all the way to closing. It needs to go to pending at some point. And so that's when, just per MLS rules, that's when it's deemed to be okay to go ahead and send it over to pending. Paragraph B, I want to make 1.2, and I know Phyllis and I have talked about this quite a bit. Let's say that I've got my parents buying a house and they're going to put 50% down on the house. Well, in that world, if the property appraises for less than sales price, then they're still going to be approved for the house. Okay, it really doesn't matter what the property appraises for, as long in their world, because they've got good credit, as long as the 50% that they're paying is not more than 80% of the appraised value. Okay, does that make sense? So let's say that they're buying a house for $250,000, they're putting 125 down. Well, even if that house appraised for 200,000, they would still be fine. The property would still pass that 2B threshold and say the property is still deemed to be approved by the lender. So if you have a client in that situation where they are just real keyed up about it has to hit that one number, it has to hit that sales price has to be on the appraisal or I am out of here, then they're probably going to need to use the other form, the termination due to lender's appraisal form, which is the next one that we're going to talk about. Addendum concerning right to terminate due to lender's appraisal. They would need to use this form because this really doesn't give them enough power to terminate if the appraisal is low. Where this gives power to terminate is for that buyer that is somebody who is putting down 5%, 3%, which so many of our consumers are. They don't have the money to put more money above and beyond appraisal down and still get qualified. And so that's where that 2B works in there.
Amy, what did you say is the 80%?
I'm sorry?
What did you say is the 80% of that? Like it's the to meet appraisal?
Yeah, so like in that circumstance where my parents are buying a house at 250, they're putting down 125, they're getting a loan for 125. Really, if it appraised for 200, they could still get a loan for up to 160 because they would still have 20% down and nothing would change. So it's just as long as they have that same measurement. So if you, let's say that you had written this offer as a 20% down option on a $200,000 purchase price for easy numbers, right? So we're at 200,000, they're going to get a loan for 160. And then the house came in appraisal at 195. Well, Well, that did screw up everything from a lender perspective, right? Because now they're getting a loan that requires mortgage insurance if they do a loan at 160. And so it does change some things. And that would be something that the buyer could get out of the contract based on 2B if they wanted to. Now that is also a buyer option deal. It's not something that is an automatic termination where the buyer automatically gets their earnest money. It's if the buyer wants to exercise it. Cool. Questions?
Yeah, I don't want to muddy the water with this, but I do have a question. If you're really concerned about that and you don't want to use the that addendum, could you put in the contract that they're only going to put 20% down?
Yes, you could. Yes. So let's say that
can technically be changed.
what Aaron's saying is, like in my parents' case, even if they were going to only do a loan for 125, could I have said, hey, they're going to get a loan for 80% of the 250, and if they can't get that, they want to have an option to get out. Then yes, I would have filled out paragraph 1 of the third party financing addendum with that information, and then that would have given them the power. Now, just because I said that they were going to get a loan for 80% of the 250 does not mean they actually have to get that. Okay. They can modify and do whatever type of loan they want to at closing, or they could pay cash. So it is very flexible to this buyer as far as what loan they want to get after they do it. Really, all this is about creating an out for them on the contract.
Mike had suggested we do that on one recently that was extremely overpriced, and the sellers were not going to budge on that appraisal addendum. And so I think we even put that they were only putting like 10% down.
Well, I like it. That's a great plan.
And then they just changed it at the last minute and put, like half down.
Yeah. And
it did work.
Do it.
I mean, it did work. It didn't appraise. I mean, that's the thing, is it would have been fine if we had put that they were putting the 50% down in the contract. I mean, we wouldn't have had that negotiating power, but the sellers had no idea that they had that kind of money.
There you go. Good. I like it. All right. Any other questions on paragraph 2? Again, this is another one that you can go back and read again. Like, it's a really powerful one, and you really want to make sure that you understand it well when you're representing either side on it. Because that's the thing too, you're representing a seller, this comes in, it's written kind of crazy, right? With like 24 days on a 30-day close in paragraph 2A. Well, now what? Now, I mean, my seller is just on pins and needles all the way through 24 days when it probably was okay. It probably was something that, your buyer was okay on it. And if you're making an offer like that and we're in a multiple offer situation, you may get sent to the bottom for something that your buyer did not realize was sending them to the bottom. Okay. So it is something that, especially in multiple offers, we really want to make sure that we're doing the best job representing the buyer, of giving them all options and explaining this so that way they can make a powerful choice on their own. All right, cool. Paragraph 3 deals with security, and then paragraph 4 is the VA FHA required provision. I'm not going to read that, but that's where you would put in the sales price there. And on VA or FHA, those consumers always have an out if it does not appraise for the full list price, or for the for the full sales price for paragraph 1. Okay, and then number 5, authorization to release information. 5A says buyer authorizes buyer's lender to furnish to seller or buyer or their representatives information relating to the status of approval for the financing. And then 5B, seller and buyer authorize buyer's lender, title company, and escrow agent to disclose and furnish a copy of the closing disclosures and settlement statements provided in relation to the closing for the sale or of the sale to the parties' respective brokers and sales agents provided under the broker information. So this part they added several years ago so that we don't have to get anything extra signed by the consumers in order for us to have full access to what information is happening with the loan. So just know, whether you represent the buyer or the seller, you can go to the lender for information. If they give you any sort of like backlash on it, you can just refer them to this paragraph. Same thing for the title company. If for any reason they're like, oh, I don't know if you have authority to get that closing disclosure, absolutely you do. It says it right here. Cool. Okay. All right, let's pause for a minute. We're going to come back and talk about the addendum concerning right to terminate due to lenders approval. So we're just going to take 3 minutes. So we'll be back at 9:55. Right, y'all. May think of any questions that you want to ask before we jump into the hardest form? It's not that hard, but it's a little hard. Okay.
Were we done with the 1 to 4?
We're coming back to it.
Okay.
We only made it to paragraph 3, so we'll have to come back to that one. But
Okay, Amy, I do have a question. Just because they had brought up the whole contingent based upon the buyer approval. When we have a listing, I always move it to pending after we get past the option period. Are you saying we should leave that as in contingent until we get past the buyer approval date?
So it's really a agent choice thing. MLS has been a little wishy-washy on what the right answer is on it. I will say for me, I like to leave it in, or I did like to leave it. I don't know that in this world that I would, but the reason why I used to leave it in active contingent was because when it's in active contingent, it's still out on all of the sites. So it's fed to all the third-party sites, it's fed everything. And so in theory, you as a listing agent, maybe get calls to go see it and you're able to develop a relationship with that buyer and yada, yada. Or also in theory, your seller is potentially showing it for backup offer and you're potentially getting backup offers on it. Reason why I say, you know, that's the theory is that in this market where we potentially already had a backup offer on it, like it really, there is no need to leave it in contingent status because it's why, like what, you know, you really don't want it to be shown anymore. Y'all are done with it. You've got plenty of people that want to buy it. And so putting it in pending is fine.
Okay.
So it just depends on kind of what property, you know, if it was like Chinnequin Oak, can't never say that word, but like the one that we had trouble selling, like that one
Yes.
was the one that, yeah, we probably want to leave it in active contingent so that it's still out there everywhere in case somebody wanted to make an offer on it.
Okay.
All right. Let's talk about addendum concerning right to terminate due to lender's appraisal. And so this is was our newest form. It was put in effect in November of 2018, and it is still giving people a heartache and headache over they don't understand how to fill it out correctly. And so let's just read through it and then you'll know, right? You'll be good. All right, so this is concerning the property at, first off, let me go to the very tip top where it says use only if third-party financing addendum is attached to the contract. So this is not for cash, okay? Because this is a lender's appraisal. So by definition, this is not cash. If you had a cash buyer that wanted to do an appraisal, I recommend they do that during the option period, and they can do whatever the heck they want to check that house during the option period. If they're paying cash for the appraisal, like, and not ordering it through the lender, they can get it done in a few days. It's not something that takes a real long time. Okay, so only if there's a third-party financing in them, and if the transaction does not involve FHA insured or VA guaranteed financing. So this is not applicable for FHA and VA. Why is it not applicable for FHA and VA? Because there's statute that says the FHA buyer or the veteran buyer cannot contractually agree to pay an amount over appraisal from the very beginning. They can't contractually enter into that. Can they choose to pay over? They can, and you can talk with your lender partner about that and help explain that to them. But there is not a way, you can't write it into special provisions, you can't have it in this form. There is not a way for that borrower to say, I will pay over appraisal from the very beginning. Now, that does, I mean, I can't make that not have their offer get put to the bottom of the pile, right? That is a limitation of FHA and VA. However, that's where then maybe you need to get creative on some of the other mechanisms where we are doing something like a really heavy option fee, a really heavy earnest money, something to make their offer more aggressive than what other offers might be. Okay. All right. So this is for conventional, really buyers only. And it says the financing described in the third-party financing addendum attached to the contract for the sale of the above reference property does not involve FHA or VA financing, and then check one box only. Sorry. And then it has these three boxes. Number one, waiver. Buyer waives the buyer's right to terminate the contract under paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum if property approval is not obtained because the opinion of value in the appraisal does not satisfy lender's underwriting requirements. If the lender reduces the amount of the loan due to the opinion of value, the cash portion of the sales price is increased by the amount of the loan, by the amount the loan is reduced due to the appraisal. So in that situation that I was talking about earlier, where we're under contract at 200, we have a buyer that is putting down 20%. And so they're doing a loan amount at 160. If the appraisal comes in at 195, the lender can now, or is only willing to lend 20% on that 195. And so the buyer is going to have to come up with a little bit more money, 20% of $5,000, right? So they're going to have to come up with, sorry. They're going to have to come up with the amount difference between the loan amount and the sales price. So that extra $5,000, the 195 to 200. Okay. So their amount of the 20% is going to be reduced just a little bit. And then that cash amount is going to be going up quite a bit to say, hey, that the buyer is going to pay that extra $5,000. So they were planning on paying $40,000. Now they're going to be paying 20% of 195 plus the 5,000 difference between the 195 and the 200. Okay. So that is just what would automatically happen in that paragraph 1 if that was chosen. Okay, automatically the amount of the cash and financing would be adjusted and everything would go on. The buyer would have nothing to say about it. It would just move on through the cycle. Okay. I will tell you right now, I hate paragraph 1 because it is giving the lender and the lender's appraiser, right? Because the appraiser is seeing the whole contract, including this form. They are seeing that, hey, the buyer is going to close on this regardless. It does not matter what you appraise this house for because the buyer is going to close. They have waived all their rights to terminate based on that. So what incentive does the lender have to try to make that appraisal work, to try to get that appraisal to value? Not very much, right? The lender and the lender's appraiser at that point, the appraiser is really just trying to save their job. And by saving their job, they are going to appraise that thing low. Okay. And when I say that saving their job is because the way that appraisers lose their job is if they appraise properties for too high and then the borrower defaults and the lender comes back and says, why did you appraise it for this high? It really was only worth this. Okay. And so the appraiser is saying, well, why am I going to even take a risk on it? I'm just going to appraise it for, the bare level amount. And so if you've checked box number 1, it's cool. Just need to really make sure that the buyer understands there is very little incentive for the appraiser to hit that value that they are in theory trying to hit, because you have already given them indication you are going to close on it no matter what. Now, some people will say, well, maybe we can just keep this form then out from the lender and not give it to them, and then they won't know. So it will be okay. No, it's not cool. Like, this is part of the contract. If it is part of the contract, it is part of the contract. And so we've got to give the lender all of the contract in order to be RESPA compliant. Okay. Okay, so that's why I don't love number 1. It's fine if the buyer wants to do it, but there is no floor here, right? That example I was saying before, it's a $5,000 difference. We had a deal earlier this year, it's actually on Spencer's house, that, it was a $70,000 shortfall on the appraisal because the buyer chose that box number 1. They didn't have an out on the contract. So sorry. Like, you either pay it or we keep your earnest money, really. Okay. Sounds heartless, but that's the way it is. Okay. Paragraph 2, partial waiver. This one is the one that I see being the most benefit to this form. So this is the one that we really need to know about. It says the buyer waives the right to terminate the contract under paragraph 2B of the third party financing addendum if property approval is not obtained because the opinion of value of the appraisal does not satisfy lender's underwriting requirements and the opinion of value is blank or more. So in that circumstance that I was talking about earlier with the 200,000 and the 160, if the buyer is okay with paying up to $5,000 over appraisal, then we would say, well, heck, as long as it appraises for 195, then we're good. We'll pay that difference. We're just not paying the difference between 150 and 200. Okay, right? So then we would check box 2 and then put in opinion of value of 195. And so I know it seems like you should just put in 5,000 there saying, hey, I'm going to pay up to $5,000 over appraisal. That's not how they wrote the form. Instead, they wrote the form of you've got to do some math on what's the sales price less the 5,000 that they're willing to pay, and then put in that number in here. Good? Whatever that number is. And I'm sorry?
That's the buyer's floor.
Buyer's floor, yes. So as long as it appraises for that. Now, if it appraises for 200, then the buyer just doesn't say anything and we just go on down the road. Like, that's okay. But again, the appraiser's seeing this. So the appraiser knows now, hey, I really don't have to reach up and hit 200. As long as I hit 195, everything's going to still go forward with this deal. Okay. And then paragraph 3 is the additional right to terminate. This one I don't love either, because I think it's waving a flag to the seller and saying, hey, I am planning on terminating if the appraisal doesn't hit this. And so this is where normally you would see the full sales price. So somebody who is putting down 50%, they aren't going to be really have the right to terminate under paragraph 2B because they're putting down so much. And so that's where you would put in that like, hey, we want it to appraise for the full 250. It does give a certain number of days, which is nice, so that it doesn't run all the way through the close date. So like maybe the buyer wanted 2 weeks to do an appraisal and make sure that it appraised for that number, and so they could put in 14 days and that number. I guess I really think we're breaking down on our job if a buyer is really concerned about what some dude, the appraiser, thinks about their house, if it doesn't matter to the lender. To me, if it doesn't matter to the lender, if they can get the loan regardless, they should just ignore whatever the appraiser says and should go on. But that's part of why we're here, is to help explain to them, like, why does it matter to you? What is that going to change? If that one guy's opinion says it's only worth 200 instead of 250, what does that do? So anyway, any questions on this addendum concerning right to terminate due to lender's appraisal?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
So in 2, let's say we have a scenario where we've listed the house for 260. We have offers 275 and greater.
Mhm.
And we have someone that is willing to pay at least 5,000 over the appraisal price. So if it comes in at 265, they've offered 275, they're still willing to pay 270. There's nothing there for that scenario.
Correct. There's not, and it's because then it creates a no limit floor for the seller. Because let's say that we wrote something into special revisions that said, hey, buyer is willing to pay $5,000 over the appraisal, whatever the appraisal comes in at. Well, then if the appraisal came in at 200,000, let's say in your scenario, then the seller only gets 205. Like that sucks. And so it really is meant by design to not be in there, because they want you to renegotiate if it comes in low. So in that circumstance, if you had somebody that was offering 275, they were willing to pay up to $5,000 over appraisal, the best thing to do is check box 2 and put in 270 there. And then just the seller needs to know if the appraisal comes in under 270, we'll have to renegotiate. Normally, there's already been the gentleman's agreement and everybody's on the same page of that, let's say it came in at 260, that we would probably go ahead and renegotiate and be locked in at 265, but there is an option for the buyer to get out at that point. And there's also an option for the seller to get out at that point, because the seller might have received a better backup offer during that time period too, that they would want to take instead of going down that path of a lower than what they planned on sales price.
Okay.
Good question. Other things about this form?
I have a question.
Just yell.
Since we're in the same room, it's kind of difficult for me because if I unmute myself, it sounds crazy. So on this, why would we ever use box 3 when the third party financing addendum kind of takes care of our buyers?
I mean, that would be if it was somebody that was going to get approved for financing regardless of what the appraisal came in at.
Okay.
So like maybe which Spencer's had a bunch of people lately that are getting appraisal waivers from the lender, which is cool. Like that's cool. Like they're so credit qualified and they're putting down so much money that the lender's like, hey, you know what? This looks good. We're just not going to do an appraisal. It's great. But sometimes the consumer wants the appraisal and they want the ability to terminate based on that. And so that's where you would use paragraph 3. Like I said, for me, I think it's more of like, we just need to educate the consumer of why that's not such a good thing for you. And we still really want to close the house. And if you want to win in a multiple offer situation, we've got to go ahead and go down this path, but that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess that just doesn't paragraph 2B in third party can I cover the buyer on that?
Not if they could qualify for the house regardless.
Okay.
Good question.
I guess, is that kind of the same as we were talking about earlier? Like if they're putting half down, you could use that?
Yes.
It's just a really stupid way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, because because like what Aaron was saying of modifying, and instead of showing your hand that you're putting 50% down, you said, hey, I'm only putting 20% down here. It's not saying, hey, they could put 50% down and still qualify. This is saying if they can't qualify for this loan as stated, then they have an out on paragraph 2B. And so that would give you more power than that. It's not like they're looking at their overall financials and saying, oh, well, these people are really good, like they can qualify for whatever. Except in the case of a appraisal waiver. And that's what I will tell you for us too, because really Spencer has been getting a lot of appraisal waivers, and we've had to go back to all of our lending partners and say, look, that's cool if our client gets an appraisal waiver, but you need to talk with us and we need to talk with the client before you just automatically press the button on DU or whatever you're pressing it on to say, oh yeah, they want that. They don't want to go forward with an appraisal. That's just saved them $400 because they may have been planning on getting that appraisal waiver. Kind of like Aaron, what you're saying in your circumstance, the house is overpriced. They needed that to go full through the appraisal because they wanted to have an out on that. And it just depends. Everybody's circumstance is different.
They did get an appraisal waiver. But Mike did such a great job of presenting like, okay, we really think, I mean, we thought this thing was like 20,000 over, and it was open door. And so it was a situation where we knew if we did get a low appraisal that we could probably get it reduced to that point. Now, if it was a regular seller, maybe not. And so it's not always needed, but this was kind of a unique situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought Mike did a great job on that because that was really kind of one of the first ones that I had walked through that they had the option to waive it, and they also had a crap ton of money, but it was a way for us to lower the price.
Yeah.
And we did. So boom, Mike.
Yay, good. All right, anything else on this one? Y'all might be thinking like, holy crap, Amy's only on paragraph 3 and like this class is moving on and she's not gonna make it through, but we're gonna make it through. All right, so we're gonna go back to the main contract and into paragraph 4, leases, and this paragraph 4 and 5, like this is a lot of the meat of the new stuff of the contract. So we're gonna hit a lot of this hard right now. All right, leases. Except as disclosed in this contract, seller is not aware of any leases affecting the property. After the effective date, seller may not, without buyer's written consent, create a new lease, amend any existing lease, or convey any interest in the property. And then check all applicable boxes. Either A, residential leases, where it says this property is subject to one or more residential leases to tenants, and the addendum regarding residential leases is attached to the contract. Paragraph B, fixture leases. Fixtures on the property are subject to one or more fixture leases. For example, solar panels, propane tanks, water softeners, security systems, and the addendum regarding fixture leases is attached to this contract. Or C, leases of natural resources, quote, natural resource lease means an existing oil and gas, mineral, water, wind, or other natural resource lease affecting the property to which the seller is a party. And then C1 is seller has delivered to buyer a copy of all the natural resource leases, or C2, seller has not delivered to buyer a copy of all the natural resource leases. Seller shall provide to buyer a copy of all the natural resource leases within 3 days after the effective date. Buyer may terminate the contract within blank days after the effective date. The buyer receives all the natural resource leases and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. Oh man, like, are y'all like, that sucks? That paragraph is like real tough. So it is tough. Like this just, to me, upped our job a a lot on both the buyer and the seller side, more on the seller side. Because basically this gives a free out to the buyer, right? If the seller does not provide all of these forms. Now, really, this is a good thing for the buyer, right? Like they need to know, like if there's a lease outstanding, like we need to know whether it's a security system or a actual lease with a tenant, like it does make sense that the seller would tell the buyer what those leases look like. But the sellers have not done this in the past. So this is completely new, especially in relationship to fixture leases and leases for natural resources. Residential leases, they should have always been providing, but they don't. So here we go. Let's talk about residential leases first. And I'm going to click through to the addendum regarding residential leases. This one is relatively self-explanatory. So it's saying, hey, if you have a residential lease, we need to go ahead and give that to the buyer really as soon as possible. So this is going to be just like HOA documentation. This is going to be just like a seller's disclosure. The sooner you can get it to them, like if you could get that to them at origination of the contract, then that's going to tighten up the timelines for the buyer to terminate the contract as much as possible. So this addendum regarding residential leases, it's going to say, hey, either all residential leases, or there may be a residential lease, but we're going to terminate it before closing. So that would be A. Or B, hey, you're going to get an assignment and you get the property with this tenant in it. Good luck. Here's all the information. And then it says like, hey, you know, the deposit is going to be transferred at closing, any prorated rents, like, and it just goes through kind of what that looks like on that. Does anybody have any questions regarding transferring a property with a residential lease or this form?
I do.
Yeah.
Is it required that the tenant is made aware of that transfer?
It is after closing. So it says immediately after in paragraph, B2, immediately after closing, buyer shall deliver to tenant a signed statement acknowledging that the buyer has acquired the property and is now responsible for the return of the security deposit and specifying the exact amount of the security deposit. Other than that, really everything is handled prior to like.
Okay. That makes sense then, because we've had a tenant that's like, I wasn't told that, you know, the house was sold, and she was like so upset at us, and I didn't know where the responsibility was on that. So there we go.
Yeah, really this mimics the estoppel process on the commercial side. So estoppel certificates are not something that we traditionally get on the residential side, but it just clarifies all the terms of the lease. And then an estoppel will go a little bit farther and get the tenant to actually sign off to say, yes, I agree that the seller of the commercial building has given all the correct information over. This is basically everything short of getting that tenant to really buy in and confirm everything on there. So anyway, so that it really is a whole lot more information for the seller, and I'm for the buyer, and I think it is good. Now here's where I'm a little upset, or not upset, just like I'm not sure how this is going to work in practice. And that's, how do we get this information to someone who is willing to make who is going to make an offer on the property that without disclosing private information potentially about a tenant or something like that. And so that's what I honestly, I haven't heard a great explanation from any attorney, and I've been on every call I can be about this contract. I just haven't heard anything great to say that, because I have a concern about us uploading existing leases into transaction desk on MLS, where then anybody can click through and see it. Well, then that's tough, right? I mean, that's tough as a tenant, that somebody pulled up and got potentially your contact information that should be on that lease, you know, how much you're paying, what, all that. So really this would likely be something that would be delivered immediately after you go under contract. So there is an opportunity in B1A to say that they have received a lease. And so maybe that was something that you emailed out separately. I just don't think it's something that goes on transaction desk, especially not transaction desk for public viewing. So on transaction desk, when you're a listing agent, hopefully you've seen the little stars on the side where you can change the stars to either be for public viewing or for MLS only viewing. Definitely it would be, if you're uploading a residential lease, it would be for MLS only viewing. I just still am a little nervous about releasing that information without having more to it. So I would say stay tuned. We'll likely get a lot more guidance on that, potentially as lawsuits are filed, but I would say for me, my choice would be potentially B2 or B1B, or that I've delivered it privately, not on MLS when they're writing the offer, so that way then they've got all that information. Good.
Amy, I have a quick question. And maybe you said it because my call keeps getting dropped, but when you transfer a lease like that, the security deposit, is that transferred as well? Because technically the original owner should have it.
Yeah, it's transferred at closing. So it's kind of like a proration of taxes or HOA or something like that. It doesn't feel like a check just got sent over to the buyer. And so that's also, want to make sure that the buyer understands, hey, you got that at closing. You may not have felt like you got a check for that at closing, but your closing costs or whatever were lowered by that. And so now you're responsible for getting that back to the tenant later. And that's part of why immediately after closing, the buyer should let the tenant know, hey, now you're paying the rent to me and I have your security deposit of this. And so it's just that much clearer after that. I imagine.
Isn't that commingling? Sorry, isn't that commingling funds if you're with everything else on the?
It would be, but it's the owner's fund. So there's no commingling when it's your property. So that commingling is only like if you were an agent for the property, not actually the owner of the property. So you're got it. So I would expect Texas Realtors to follow this up with a sheet that kind of modifies where it's a really easy notice for the buyer to give to the tenant after closing of, hey, this is what we're doing. I just haven't seen that yet. So cool. All right, so that is addendum concerning residential leases. Let's get into fixture leases. So like we said, fixture leases are more like solar panels, propane tanks, water softener, security system. I think solar panels are going to be our biggest headache on this, right? But there could be other things. It could be, somebody has a deal with this big ADT deal, or I don't know. I don't know, all these things that are fixture leases. I don't think any of us love fixture leases because it is just kind of a dirty world of real estate, right? That these people are going and getting residents to sign off on all this, and it's just hard. So lease fixtures are for those on the property. They enumerate those that I said, and then it also has, or you can fill in the blank. And then it says buyer shall assume and seller shall assign to buyer the fixture leases at closing except the following blank. And then buyer shall pay the first blank of any cost necessary to assume or receive assignment of the fixture leases, and seller shall pay any remainder. Buyer and seller agree to sign any documents required by the lessor of the fixture leases to assume or assign the fixture leases. And then 2, prior to closing, seller will or will not remove the leased fixtures covered by the fixture leases that the buyer does not assume. Seller will repair any damage to the property caused by any removal. Notice any leased fixtures remaining in the property are subject to the rights of the lessor under the fixture lease. And then delivery of fixture leases. Again, this gets back to the same concern that I have of privacy, because those fixture leases are going to have a lot of information on that regarding the actual seller of the property, not just their name, but potentially their email address and phone number, or whatever it is about it and what they're paying. So I think this again gets back into the same situation of that we potentially need to hold off and deliver this to parties that are actually interested in making an offer on the property, or sending it to them immediately after we go under contract. But let me stop here and say, this is not something that we need to be gathering this documentation after we go under contract from the seller. Okay. So hear me now, hear me later. Like y'all are going to hear me say this over and over again, right? These things, residential leases, fixture leases, natural resource leases, these are things that we have to gather as a listing agent prior to going on the market. Like it is going to make your life hell, and you are going to potentially open your seller up to a huge option on these contracts if you don't gather this information before. Now, is it going to take some time for the sellers to get that? Yeah, they can't find their survey, right? How are they going to find this stuff? Like, this is not a great situation for the seller because they've got to document all this stuff. I mean, I'll tell you, I mean, we don't have a water softener system. Maybe I don't, maybe people do have these contracts just right at hand, but I just cannot imagine that a lot of these people, especially even, I mean, these solar panels stuff, like y'all, these are like 30-year contracts with a solar panel company. Like they're not out there referencing these documents all the time. So they're going to have to dig, they're going to have to get updated information from these people, and they're going to potentially have to figure out what the transfer policy is. So it gets back to like that HOA situation, right? They're going to have to go and do some work to really figure out how to get this information to give to the buyer.
This is a conversation we're going to have just the minute they say they want to list.
For sure. Yeah. And it is just so different and so much more invasive than what we've done before, right? I mean, and we've always had an option out, like, oh, you can't find the survey. It's okay. We'll just order a new survey. Well, not on this. Like I can't, like you have to find it. I can't have you enter into a contract until you find it, or go ahead and remove everything, repair the property, and then we go under contract. Cause it's, I mean, I've got to have it. I got to know.
Amy, do you think that we shouldn't list a house if they say there's a lease and they can't find it?
Yes.
I mean, what do you do? Yeah, that's really how serious it is, right?
This is really,
Wouldn't you be able to contact the people that
you're paying,
have the lease? Because anytime like I can't find any documents on anything, you just contact them directly. They can send you the contract.
And that does work if you've still got a good working relationship with that person, and hopefully they do. I mean, in theory, these are things that they are making payments to, maybe annually, hopefully monthly, so that they do have some open line of communication with that provider and they can go to it and get it.
Well, even if they have like an individual seller, I mean, it's with a company specifically, not necessarily that seller itself. So they should be able to still get that contract.
In theory, you're right. But like, let's say that the solar panel company, you know, some dude came to their door, they bought solar panels, and they've been making this payment to, you know, to Uzbekistan or something, and they don't really know who's there. And they've tried to call that company, but nobody's calling them back. You know, it's that kind of stuff that's where this could get hard. And you've got all of these people that are companies that have fixture leases too. And now they are going to get real aggressive on, they want to make sure that that buyer understands the fixture lease and that they are going to be committed to the fixture lease going forward. And so it just does create some kind of weirdness there. The other thing, and where this is coming in and is so important, is because any payments that are reflected on these fixture leases are going to have to be added into the DTI for your buyer when they buy the house. So let's say that we have a solar panel lease, and this, you know, dude that came in and sold them solar panels told them, hey, $100 a month for these solar panels. I just saved you $200 a month on your electricity bill. You're welcome. Congratulations. You are a smart consumer because you just bought these solar panels from me. Well, that's great. But now when you go to sell your house, I usually wouldn't have my utility bill in my debt to income ratio, right? Now I do. So now if I am selling my house to a buyer, that buyer has to qualify for that whole house plus that $100 a month, or they can't buy the house. And so that's why this is part of the contract now, is because they want to make sure, first off, that the buyer understands, you know, what they're getting into, but also this is all a money play. They're trying to make sure that the buyer is not getting overwhelmed with debt to income and that they're not doing a loan on something that the buyer shouldn't qualify for. So, you know, that's where this is tricky, right? Like, how do I upload this information onto MLS and then have everybody be able to see it, that it's $100 a month payment, but then also keep the information private. Like it's just going to change the way we're thinking about things and some best practices on some of this. So we'll see some different things coming out. I think more information, like more kind of baseline information of, hey, plan on $100 a month and then the lease coming or something like that, so that it's a little bit separate.
Amy, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So is it just so common that the buyer has to assume this lease, or do they ever get out of it? Like, I mean, it doesn't ever go, like it can't be, like it has to be transferred?
It depends. If it can be terminated, that's something, again, that we need to negotiate before we go under contract, right? And so, like, let's say that ADT is fairly easy to get out of, y'all. I mean, even though they suck and that's whatever, but they're fairly easy to get out of. So in that circumstance, like, you may have leased equipment in the house, but there's a way to figure out how to get out of it. But the seller still has to give all that information to the buyer and either confirm that, hey, they're going to terminate that fixture lease in A2. So like the seller will remove all the lease fixtures so that way then the buyer does not assume the lease, or, you know, how that's going to go. And same thing, I mean, the problem is it can be really bad. I mean, you're talking about some of these solar leases being $50,000. I mean, it's not without, and on these $125,000 houses, y'all. I mean, it's just really, that I will tell you, this is one of the areas where people are getting taken advantage of so much in their home ownership. And so I think that's part of why too, that Texas wants to be just very clear. Hey, what obligations is that new buyer going to have under the lease, or are they going to be able to get out of it? And like, let's deal with it before we close, because I think a lot of this has been happening after closing. Cool. Not cool.
I noted.
Yeah.
On this one, I closed back in December, out in Crowley. They're out in the country, kind of. They have their own septic system, and I guess Johnson County requires you have to have a company that's leased out that takes care of it. So that was one of the one of the things that was added besides their propane tank that they had a lease on, that they had to take over. And I mean, there was quite a few things, and some of it was prepaid, so they got that credit.
Yeah.
But I'd never seen anything like it. Obviously, I'm brand new, but at least they had everything together.
That is good. One of those, that Johnson County deal, is actually in this section where it's property located in a certificated service area of a utility service provider. I'm pretty sure that it's in that, where that's saying, hey, that utility service provider, it becomes part of a municipal utility district. And that then is like, you have to participate in the utility district, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the septic system was leased. It was like they had to get their provider from there, but they didn't have to lease the equipment. And so we're going to get into a lot of like little distinctions on that too, where like the propane tank, the actual stuff of it was leased, and then they potentially had to buy a propane from one guy, and versus like they owned the septic, but they had to get the service from somebody. It's going to get really weird, y'all, with the way these leases are going and how it's going to go. And like, we're going to have to just get deeper on like who really has it and who has the right to get out. Okay, then this leases of natural resources and natural resource lease. That so Phyllis, to your point on this one, I don't know how the seller's going to get this. I mean, y'all, because I mean, we have active leases on properties that I don't even know how I would get it. I guess I would go to the county and try to find it. How do I go to the county? Maybe I would go to a title company and try to get it. Like, this one is going to cause a huge mess because it's not something that you're getting regular payments on. It's not something that really you have like an open line of communication with the people. And it's something that could have been done years ago because they automatically extend. So like on ours, I mean, we probably executed those leases 2005, 2006, and they are still going. We're still getting marginal payments on them, but I don't have a copy of the actual lease. So this is, again, it's going to be problematic, but if we don't get it, if the seller doesn't participate in getting it prior to us going on the market, then what happens? Well, then we check C2 And it would be that the seller has 3 days to get it to him. And if they don't, then the buyer can terminate the contract. Well, so what? So if I never get it to them, then what? Then I'm just, they have potentially all the way up until closing to terminate. Now, what if the minerals have been excluded? Either they're excluded in this offer, or they were excluded in a prior deal. Really doesn't matter. Well, actually, I should say that. Let's say that they're being excluded in this deal. So let's say like Spencer and I are selling our house on Canterbury. We have a mineral lease that's in effect. We're going to keep that lease and we're going to keep the minerals on it. We still have to disclose to that future buyer what that lease says. And if we don't, then the buyer has the out of the contract. Okay. So this one is, again, it's just a really tricky deal. I'm sure there will be providers that will pop up to help consumers pull this data and find it. Title companies hopefully will dig in, but all the title companies right now are pointing fingers out. They're saying like, I'm not sure how y'all are going to get that. And so it's just waiting to see how this comes about on some of that.
Okay,
What
so
about,
even if,
about
go ahead.
what about on like, okay, so like you were talking about mineral lease. So what if you didn't take possession of the minerals and now you want to go around and sell the house 5 years down the road? You didn't take possession of those.
Then that's okay, because you weren't the one that executed it.
So it's only a matter of who decides to keep those, even though they're selling the house. They've got to show it.
Yeah, and it's more about like who has an active lease on it. So like if you are an owner of a house and you are getting lease payments on it, like Aaron, that's probably you, right? Because y'all have had your house for a long time. So y'all owned it back in the day when, Barnett Shale became a thing and we figured out that there was a minimal amount of value there. And so Aaron and Jason executed a lease back in the day for it. They're still getting $50 a year from it, which they have to file taxes on. It just becomes a huge pain in the ass, but whatever. So they're still getting that $50. And so if she goes to sell the house, whether she is going to retain the minerals or not, because she was a party to that contract, she's going to have to give it to the buyer, give a copy to the buyer. So she's going to have to find it. Right. Like Aaron, do y'all know where yours is?
No clue.
Yeah.
In fact, it's been sold like 80 times. So
Yeah.
I'd probably have to go back to my taxes from last year.
And figure out what company, and then call that company and try to get, but see, like, so Lynette though, like Lynette doesn't own her minerals because the developer in Mar-a-Lagos like figured out before she bought the house, hey, there's value here, I'm going to take it out before. And so she doesn't have to provide anything on a Mar-a-Lagos property. So it just opens up where every client we're going to have to talk to about how long have they owned it? Do they know what the minerals are? Where, how did they sign something back in the day? How did they do? And so mostly we're going to be looking for those homeowners that were a party to the, like owned the house in that 2005 to 2008-9 timeframe, because that's when most of the mineral leases were executed in the Metroplex. If you're dealing with something outside the Metroplex, if you're dealing with a timber lease or something like that, then it's a whole different ballgame.
So if you're selling your house and you don't disclose that, does that come up in the title commitment? Like, or like, how am I, like, if I'm representing the buyer and I'm the buyer's agent, like, how am I supposed to figure that out so that my buyer can back out if they don't agree with it?
That's where, yeah, I don't know, honestly. I mean, I wish I had a better answer than I don't know, but how the heck do you know? Like, and really, I guess just section C would not be checked at all. And so then the assumption would be like, hey, I don't have any information because I don't have any, I was not a party to any natural resource leases. And then they go on that. Now, if the seller thinks that they didn't and they did, then they are potentially open for lawsuits, that kind of thing. But, hopefully they kind of know.
Okay.
One question I have, Amy, is based on this, do you think we should just not use the new contracts until April, till some of this has been ironed out?
I mean, if there's a question about one of those, maybe, but I mean, hopefully, I mean, you're only talking about 45 days there. So, I mean, we're going to have to deal with it sooner than later. I don't know that that's enough time to actually get much of it ironed out.
Except maybe if we knew a seller listing in February doesn't know where it is.
That's true. But then they're
You
going to
know?
they're going to have to deal with the old option and some of that stuff too. And so they would just have to weigh their benefits. I mean, ultimately, they're going to need to find it one way or the other. They're going to need to find it.
Right,
It always should have been. It's just this is now calling the question.
right.
Anybody else? Questions on this part? Okay, let's take a 3-minute break. We'll come back at 10:45. Cool. All right, y'all. Let me start bring this back up. Okay, let's dig into paragraph 5. This is the biggest change regarding the new contract that we hope is beneficial. We'll see. Let me also say about paragraph 4, you know, that was where we had the license holder disclosure. That got moved down to paragraph 8. Make sure that I'm not lying about that? Yes, paragraph 8. So if you have a related party that you're doing the contract for, or it's you, it's just, they just moved it. So it's not that it went away. It's just that that's down there in paragraph 8. All right, earnest money and termination option. So this part of the contract is giving now the parties a right to deliver both the earnest money and the option fee to the escrow agent. And so that way then it, in theory, prevents us from having the headache and heartache of delivering earnest money and option fee to 2 different places, us / the seller. You know, really that's what we're trying to make it easier for the consumer. And I think this really will. Let me read through it and see what you think. So it says A, delivery of earnest money and option fee within 3 days after the effective date. So this is now not having a different way to count days for earnest money and option. Both are the same. Within 3 days after the effective date, buyer must deliver to blank as escrow agent at blank address, blank as earnest money, and blank as the option fee. The earnest money and option fee shall be made payable to escrow agent and may be paid separately or combined in a single payment. Then 1, buyer shall deliver additional earnest money of blank to escrow agent within blank days after the effective date of the contract. Don't use that all that often, but it's still there. Then number 2, if the last day to deliver the earnest money, option fee, or additional earnest money falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, basically any time that the title company is closed, but not just as an after hours situation. The time to deliver the earnest money, option fee, or additional earnest money as applicable is extended until the end of the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So this goes back where we're calculating the whole thing the same as we did earnest money before. So it's not that same option fee where we may have to deliver on a holiday or a weekend. Then number 3, the amount or amounts the escrow agents receive under this paragraph shall be applied first to the option fee, then to the earnest money, then to the additional earnest money. This was a big part of it because we were concerned. Let's say that they were really supposed to give 1,000 for option and 100 for option and 1,000 for earnest money, that if they accidentally only gave 1,000, would that go just to option or would that go just to earnest? Like, how does that go? And so it goes first to option, then it partially pays the earnest money. And so they're still in default because they haven't fully put the earnest money in there, but at least they still have the option to terminate. Okay. And then number 4, buyer authorizes escrow agent to release and deliver the option fee to seller at any time without further notice or consent from the buyer, and releases escrow agent from liability for delivery of the option fee to seller. The option fee will be credited to the sales price at closing. All right, so it took apart that little will or will not. So that's good news on there. As far as the option fee will or will not be credited towards the sales price. What is problematic on this section is that they did not declare how long the title company has before they deliver money to the seller. Okay, so it does declare how long the buyer has to give money, but it doesn't say when does the seller get that option fee. Okay. What the title companies have said as of right now is that they are not willing to say when they are going to deliver it, and that it will be different for every title company. And so you'll need to get with your title officer to see what that company's provision is going to be, or on whatever contract you're doing, to figure out when the seller is going to get that option fee. It is the seller's money. I mean, it's not like it's going to go away. But what the title companies are trying to fight about is that they don't want to write checks that maybe the buyer's check bounced, right? They want to make sure with so much certainty that that money is good, legit funds in their account before they are going to give that money to the seller. Well, so then that puts the seller in this weird time frame of that they don't, first off, how do they know if it wasn't paid timely? How do they know if the check bounced? How do they know? Like, it's just this kind of awkward deal that we don't know exactly how all of it is going to settle out yet. And it is open to every title company having a different policies and procedures based on this, which I don't love. Y'all have questions about that section, about how you're making the payment and what the title companies are going to do?
So it sounds like this has really become more complicated than easier. Is there, I don't see it in here, but is there an option to have them give the option fee directly to the seller as we do today? Or is that just gone?
That is totally gone. So there will not be that option going forward. Everybody is opting into this way only. And they're trying to do that to try to make it an even playing ground. And I think the thought process was there, good. What I am hugely frustrated about is that all these title companies are doing different things. The other thing, I mean, y'all have heard me talk about in Broker Roundtable and that kind of thing, that I'm frustrated because we also don't have a consistent way to pay for this stuff to the title company. You've got some title companies using Zocom, and you've got some title companies using SmartSure, and you've got some title companies, they're all using these different systems. And so then to me, that also makes it very inconsistent from a consumer perspective. To me, it's difficult to trust when there are so many different title companies and so many different systems, how they're accepting payment in, that it's going to be a really tricky thing for the consumer to really buy into this method, especially when they're saying like, when we're having to say like, well, hold on, let me call, this title company that was, put in MLS for benefit of the seller. Let me call them and try to figure out what their policies and procedures are going to be related to this. It's just kind of a crappy deal, but I think it's one of those that this is going to be a little bit like the termination option that we've stomped our feet and prayed and hoped that we would not have to have a termination option that ended at midnight, because y'all, that's what we had for a long time. And so we said, just anything other than midnight is going to be so great. And now it's 5 o'clock and it's like, oh man, but that 5 o'clock is tough, y'all. Maybe you should switch it to something else. Well, now they're not switching it. So, and it's not that 5 o'clock is still, y'all, it's better than midnight for sure. But it's just tough because we all have stuff going on at 5 o'clock. A lot of times it's really not a convenient time to have everything stopped to negotiate or to send over a termination or whatever. So anyway, I think that's what this is going to end up a little bit of, that we have some unintended consequences of the benefit of combining those payments, is that now we're going to have some struggle with how does that actually go in practice. I think the positives will outweigh, but.
Well, I think title companies will try to figure this out fairly quickly, because if not, you're going to have agents that won't use the title company if they can't figure out how to quickly get these checks to the sellers. I mean, you're going to go with a title company who does the best interest for your seller. So.
Yeah, if you have the power to choose, it's gonna start having more fights over, well, I want to close the my title company. Well, they pay out this or they do that. And so I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it shakes out. I don't think it's gonna be terrible. I just think we've got to know. We've got to know that it's just not a one size fits all. And I guess I just assumed in all of the lead up to this was that it was going to be awesome and that we're going to have no problems related to this at all. So anyway, I think that's the worst part of it, though. I think the other part is going to be good. We're gonna have to figure it out. Okay, so then paragraph 5B, it's the same paragraph that we had in paragraph 23. For nominal consideration, the receipt of which the seller acknowledges and buyer's agreement to pay the option fee, blah, blah, blah. It still says, hey, within the number of days, and it ends at 5 p.m. All the same stuff there. Then 5C is failure to deliver earnest money, saying again, if the buyer fails to deliver the earnest money, then they can be in default of the contract. Or if they fail to deliver the option fee in paragraph D, then they would have no unrestricted right to terminate per paragraph 5B. And then time is of the essence for this paragraph, and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. I'm assuming that will be bolded to once we have that saying that, hey, 5 o'clock is the hard and fast, like that's the end of the option period on here. And it's hard and fast on delivery of the payment for the earnest money or the option. Questions about that? It's really not that different. It's really basically the same and a little bit easier as far as they both have the same timeline. The consumer's only going to have to write one check. Really, the hardest thing is that whole, we've just got to figure out policies and procedures for the different title companies.
I have a question.
Okay.
So when we're talking to a title company about how they're going to distribute option, what should kind of be our expectation or I mean, if they're saying, hey, and I'm thinking more from a seller, what is my question? How should we prep our seller for when they'll receive those funds?
Yeah, I mean, it'd really be based on whatever that title company says. And I don't know that it really matters all that much, y'all, because it does say the buyer has already authorized the escrow agent to release and deliver the option fee. Okay, so it's not like the buyer could come back and say, oh, I don't want the house anymore, so don't give that money to them or something like that. Really, the only thing that why that delay is being caused is that they want to make sure that the money clears, that it doesn't bounce. Well, it's kind of the same thing that the seller was subject to when they were accepting a personal check too, right? So it doesn't really change their overall position that much. It's not like they are at risk of not getting that payment. They're only at risk of the buyer funds not being there. And when they get money from the title company, whenever that is, those are going to be good funds. That's real money in the account. Because title companies aren't going to write a check that's maybe. You're good with that?
Well, and thinking back to how we did it like 10 years ago, when they delivered it to the listing agent, we would receipt it and then we would put it in the mail.
Yeah.
Those sellers didn't get that check for 7 days probably.
Yeah.
And that was like, nobody cared.
Well, and how many times do we have this where the seller didn't, even
know what it was or deposit it?
Yeah. So, it's a little bit problematic. I will tell you, honestly, I don't know that I would be adding into my system like a whole bunch of fight or a whole bunch of any which way on it. It's just going to be, I just think it's just inconsistent for the consumer and just kind of awkward for us to not know.
What are you hearing as far as time frame? Like, has Alamo or Old Republic or any of these said like this is our intention?
Everybody is like, we're going to wait and hear what the other people say. Like, I think it'll be something in the 7 to 14 days. It's not going to be fast. Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be something and that's going to be from when they get it. Like, they are going to really want to, even if you did electronic delivery, even if you delivered them a wire or cashier's check, they're going to want to give themselves plenty of time to make sure that money is good.
Seems like a bookkeeping nightmare for them.
It is. And I will tell you that's why this has taken so long to get added to the contract, because they have not wanted this from the very beginning. I'm surprised that the deal got struck for them to actually participate in this, because they have been so adamant that, hey, we're not a party to the contract. We don't want this pressure on us any more than y'all want the pressure on you. Don't put us in the middle of it. But it really is the best thing for the consumer. And I think that's where TREC's head was that, hey, I get y'all don't want this, but y'all need to have this, because it is, it's not acceptable for the consumer to have to write 2 checks because the consumer is the one, right? The buyer is the one who's responsible for delivery of those checks to those different places. We just do it as an accommodation as their agent. And so from TREC's perspective, they're like, you know what, we're just going to make it super clear. They go to actual physical business. They don't have to deal with dropping it in a mailbox, taking a picture, any of that crazy stuff that we've had to do all this time. They go to a legitimate business. They either deposit the funds electronically or they give them a check, but it is a much more established process than what has been, especially related to option fee.
Well, in all fairness, I feel like checks are bouncing more now than I've seen in the past. I don't think it's because people don't have the funds. I think it's because they're moving too fast.
Yeah.
I mean, I just had it happen on 2 of mine that I'm like, what?
And they don't know how to write a check, y'all. They have not written a check since the last time they bought a house. Y'all, it's just so crazy, the whole thing. But that is really real versus if they can get on an app or they can do an electronic delivery or whatever, like they're used to that. That's how the consumers are doing. And so I think it will actually, from a consumer perspective, be a lot easier. I wish there would be more consistency between the title companies. I really wish TDI would come out and say, hey, if you're going to do electronic delivery, we have adopted this electronic delivery source, but yeah, they're trying to make sure free trade and all that stuff, you know, that it's not. I just think it's tough from a consumer perspective. Like, oh, wait, I did earnest money that way, but now I need to do it this way. And now I need to do it that way. It probably will not be a big deal over time. I mean, it's just like when I do DoorDash or Grubhub or whatever, like I just have to know what title company comes with which app. Just the same way as I have to know which sushi restaurant has which app, whatever. So,
Well, most of the time we're marking option to be returned to the buyer at closing anyway.
yes.
Right.
And so that's kind of
Aren't ultimately keeping that money anyway. And instead of acting like that's a great big deal, like we're going to rush this small amount of money over to you and like you're going to have $200, $300 in your hand, you know, that's stupid anyway, because it's going back to the buyer.
Well, and that's a really good point, Phyllis, because, and I think that may be why all the title companies are being silent to it, is saying they probably will have a process where the seller can request the option fee prior to closing, but they may just have the seller leave it in their escrow account until it goes through to closing. The money's there. It's basically additional earnest money that's already been pre-negotiated, that it would go to the seller if it needed to. But it doesn't really need to. I mean, really the seller, that $100.
It doesn't need to.
Right.
It doesn't need to at all. And also they're protected if the buyer terminates. The title company will make sure they get that money.
Right. I agree. And and that's laid out really nicely in here. So I think it'll just be different.
I think once everybody gets used to it, this is better.
I agree.
I think though, unless there was an option fee that, once again, trying to get creative in offers, it's like a $5,000 option fee because we know the seller needs that now, or, you know, and make that, get it. Yeah.
And that's where I think they'll probably start like an opt-in process where they're like, hey, seller, we're going to hold on to it unless you tell us, you know, unless you fill out this form, unless you do whatever, and then we'll go ahead and release it to you. But just know then we're going to take it back from you at closing. Yeah. I think it'll be kind of like that, where they'll do something similar after the 7 to 14 days that they are going to give themselves. So anyway. All right. So see, like y'all thought the contract was going to be really scary about that one, and it's not that bad. That one's going to be okay. The leases really is the bigger part, and maybe the consumer doesn't have any leases, and so then that's not that big a deal. So we're okay on all of it. It's going to be fine. All right. Paragraph 6. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Paragraph 6 is title policy and survey. We're still seeing the option of whether the seller or buyer's expense for the title policy, and then it has down where you list the actual title company that's going to close the house. Then 6A8, the standard printed exception as to discrepancies, conflicts, shortages in area, or boundary lines, encroachments, or protrusions, or overlapping improvements either will not be amended or deleted from the title policy, or will be amended to read shortages in area at expense of blank. So still, I'm going to go with the same recommendation that I had before, that it would always be that we select 6A2, where it says will be amended to read shortages in area and at the expense of. Honestly, it is such a small expense. It doesn't matter a ton. I think it's more appropriate for the buyer to buy it. However, if the buyer is not going to buy it, I don't think it's a bad idea for the seller to buy it for the buyer to limit their risk as well. Because basically this is saying, hey, title company, you are taking ownership of not just the title, like saying that, hey, I own this property, lot A, block B of whatever, but that lot A, block B is also what is on this piece of paper survey wise, you know, and that is what it's going to do. And it's going to have some protection for the buyer if there was ever a claim against that. The fee for that is 5% of the owner title policy amount. And that is just really usually less than $100, maybe $100, something like that. And it's such a small amount, and it gives coverage for that buyer for the whole time that they own the property. And really even beyond that. So I think it's a really good value for it to go ahead and check 6A82. All right, commitment, it just says that within 20 days, the title, that within 20 days, the title company will get the commitment to you, survey. So this is, again, another conversation we need to be having with the seller prior to listing, because if the seller does not deliver the survey within the number of days in paragraph C1, if that is checked, then the buyer can, or actually it says the buyer shall obtain a new survey at the seller's expense no later than 3 days prior to the closing date. Really, we just want to tighten that up. Either the seller has it or they don't. And if they are delivering the old survey, they have to deliver the existing survey, and the T47 affidavit fully completed. Y'all know we do have some language on the zip forms template, so that if that seller cannot get to a notary, they can opt out of the notarization of the T47 with that language that Jeff wrote, and that's in special provisions. You do not have to use that language. It's only in the event that your seller can't get in front of a notary and needs to have kind of an exemption from the T47 and can only submit the survey in that circumstance. Good. Okay. And then if the existing survey or affidavit is not acceptable to the title company or the buyer's lender, buyer shall obtain a new survey at either the seller or the buyer's expense no later than 3 days prior to the closing date. If we know that there is not an existing survey, really we need to be checking 2 or 3 so that they can be done well before 3 days prior to the closing date. And so if you know from the very beginning, hey, they don't have a survey, check 2 or 3. And that way then you can get the survey done relatively quickly and then tighten up the objection time period in paragraph D. Okay, so paragraph D is that the buyer may object in writing to defects, exceptions, or encumbrances to title disclosed on the survey other than items 6A1 through 7 above, or disclosed in the commitment other than 6A1 through 9 above, or which prohibit the following use or activity. Okay, basically all that's saying is, hey, if there's something on the commitment or there's something on the survey that you don't like, you can object, and you get even farther with that and specify things that you don't want on here. So what you should not be including in paragraph 6D on that line that says what activity is something like residential use, single family use, anything like that. You don't need to put that in. What you need to put in is if they are doing something beyond that, because residential use is already assumed and the buyer already has the right to terminate if for some reason they can't do those things on there. What you would want to put on paragraph 6D, that blank, is things like they want to add a carport, they want to run a home daycare through that property, or they are planning on doing elder care in that building, or that, you know, something that is unique to what they are wanting to do, and that they might want the option to opt out if they find something different than something on the commitment for it. You also see a lot of times put in and install a swimming pool or something like that. Something like that would also be appropriate to be put on that line. But don't be afraid to leave it blank. If they don't have anything specific that they're planning on doing, they're just going to move in and it's all going to be hunky-dory, then it's okay to leave that line blank. The line that I do not want blank, and I do pick on people about this, and I don't go to everybody, but y'all, it's blank so often and it's such a bad deal, is that second part where it says buyer must object the earlier of the closing date or blank days after the buyer receives the commitment, exception documents, and survey. Okay, if that number of days is blank, then you have all the way to the closing date because you didn't say a date that was earlier than that. And so the buyer can opt out for basically anything on the commitment, the survey, or the title exception documents. They can opt out. And so it gives them this huge option if you did not have a number of days in there. Now, how many days is fair? It depends. If you're representing the seller, you want that to be like 1 or 2. If you're representing the buyer, you want it to be like 14. So I think somewhere in that 5 to 8 days range is probably appropriate. I think I have in the template right now 3, and that's probably not enough because that does not exclude weekends. So I'll be changing that to about 5 probably, but you could make it longer than that if you wanted to give more protection to your buyer. And most listing agents don't understand this provision, and so they don't care. They'll they'll give you more days than that because they just don't understand this paragraph. Can I help with anybody on that paragraph?
I have a question. What if a buyer buys a property cash or conventional and it doesn't have a certificate of occupancy because it's been recently rehabbed? I normally do put residential use in D, paragraph D, but what if something like that happens?
Yeah, that one might be, or like say certificate of occupancy obtained or something like that. Like if there was some question of is it habitable, then yeah, I would say something like that. I think that's a good one to put in. So I will tell y'all this paragraph 6D is the one that attorneys come back to over and over and over again to get buyers out of contracts. Okay. If you had a buyer that forgot to turn in their option fee and they still want to get out, boom, 6D gets them out. You know, if they, for whatever reason, they got all the way, you know, to a day before closing and they were just like, get me the heck out of here. I don't want to buy this house. 6D is what the attorneys are going to check very first on everything. And it doesn't matter what you have written in there as much as like, do you still have number of days left? Do you still have time, or have you already passed the number of days since your commitment survey and title exception documents were sent? So just know this one is a big deal, especially for attorneys. And so we just want to make sure that anything that the attorneys are looking at that we've got good. Cool. Any questions? Okay. All right. Title notices, really this box right here, which once this goes from draft into physical form, we'll see where that kind of lines up on the page. It has been forgotten a lot right now because in the old contract, it was right towards the bottom, but this is just saying mandatory membership in Property Owners Association. If membership is mandatory, then you should attach the mandatory membership in a Property Owners Association form. And so that's where you would check is subject to that. I'm going to flip over to that form real quick because there were a couple of changes to that on here. I don't think it's that significant changes. Some of the attorneys think it is really significant changes. I think it's more of just cleanup. I'm just going to, okay, first off, y'all know, I think that HOA documents should be requested when we go to list a property, and they should be uploaded onto MLS to tighten up the option for buyers to get out based on this too. Because when you select A1, it says within blank days after the effective date of the contract, seller shall obtain, pay for, and deliver subdivision information to buyer. And then if the seller delivers subdivision information, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after the buyer receives subdivision information or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So if it takes you 3 weeks to get the HOA documents in, which it can, then the buyer has a free option up until day 24. So that's just a lot. So I know it's like really easy to let the title company deal with the HOA documents. You just, you know, sit back and don't really mess with it. It just all happens at the title company level and you're not dealing with it, but it does open up your client for a lot more option for getting out. It's not, you know, as long as they understand that, then that's okay. Because if they don't, when they get the HOA information prior to going under contract, they're going to have to pay before they ever go on the market. So they're going to have to contact their HOA company. They're going to have to order the subdivision information. And usually there is a fee somewhere between, sometimes it's free, but up to $400 or $500. If they don't sell the house, they can renew that and get it updated if they need to, but likely they'll sell the house and it'll be fine. They're going to have to pay for it one way or the other. And that is just a way to tighten up that number of days of option for the buyer. Okay. Most of the time when you're writing an offer for the buyer, this listing agent has not done that. And so then your buyer has this free option until they get that subdivision information plus 3 days. Cool. Okay. What changed on this form was the section C where and D. So the section D was taken out where it says buyer shall pay any deposits for reserves required at closing by the association. Instead, they said in section C, fees and deposits for reserves, except as provided by paragraph A and D, buyer shall pay any and all association fees, deposits, reserves, and other charges associated with the transfer of the property not to exceed blank, and the seller shall pay any excess. So how much is that? Well, the buyer doesn't know, right? The buyer has no idea how much they're going to owe for all of these HOA fees. And so instead, they're going to fill this out and say, hey, I'm going to limit my HOA participation in whatever this is, transfer fees, any of it, to $100 or $1,000 or $5,000, whatever they want to do, they can put in there, and whatever the amount is, they'll pay it, and then the seller will pay any excess. So again, if they want to make their offer really aggressive, they can go high on that. So all of
What
it.
is your opinion of an amount there, Amy? If you were being aggressive?
No, I'd put in, $100,000. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, I would go super high, but I think 5,000 is totally reasonable to put in there if you're wanting to be an aggressive offer. So anyway, but that is different than the subdivision information. That resale package, no matter what the buyer puts in there, the resale package is different and the seller is paying for that. Okay. All right, back to the contract. And let's go. So I'm just going to skip through the rest of paragraph 6. It's all good stuff. It's all good stuff, but it's a lot of like no changes have been made, and it's not anything that you can change of the contract for the buyer. Section 7, nothing has changed. I'm just going to go over it real quickly. That excess inspections and utilities, that is important that the seller knows they have to permit the buyer to come in and inspect the property, and that they have to have the utilities on. Hold on. At seller's expense, seller shall immediately cause existing utilities to be turned on and shall keep the utilities on during the time this contract is in effect. A lot of times they forget that, and that they have to keep the utilities on the whole time that they own the house, all the way through walkthrough. Seller's disclosure, hopefully we're checking box number B1 that the seller, that the buyer has already received the notice. Really, either way, whether we're representing the buyer or representing the seller, just since that's best practice to hopefully know what the buyer is getting into, and it also tightens up that timeline for the seller. Paragraph 7D, where they either accept the property as is or accept the property as is with the following repairs and treatments. That would be a good area to use if you have something that you're excluding on paragraph 2. So like a TV mount. If you want the TV, if you're okay with the TV mount being excluded, you might want to add into paragraph 7D2 wall repaired behind TV mount or something like that. That's really what this is meant for, not necessarily like rebuilding the swimming pool or something like that. You could put something like that in here. If you were doing something major, you would likely want to attach an exhibit to say what company was going to do the work, like just to make sure that everybody's on the same page with what work is being done. Most of the time, work is going to be contemplated in an amendment after the option period. However, I'm seeing less and less of that at this point. I'm seeing more just either potentially an amount for towards closing costs in lieu of repairs, or just no repairs being done at all. The buyer is really taking the property as is. Any questions on any of that or things y'all are seeing? And then paragraph 7H for residential service contracts, that's our home warranty section. And it says that buyer may purchase a residential service contract from a residential service company licensed by TREC. If buyer purchases a residential service contract, seller shall reimburse buyer at closing for the cost of the residential service contract in an amount not exceeding blank. Then buyer should review any residential service contract for the scope of coverage, exclusions, and limitations. And then in bold, the purchase of a residential service contract is optional. Similar coverage may be available from various companies authorized to do business in Texas. Reason why I wanted to mention that paragraph is I didn't mention it in the deal 2 weeks ago, the best practices deal. I will tell you, it is still a great process to have a home warranty in that. You know, home warranties came about because they were trying to reduce our risk and the risk of the seller for the buyer by having it where if the buyer moved in and on day one, the dishwasher didn't work or the water heater crapped out or whatever, that it wasn't a call to an attorney saying, hey, that SOB seller should have known that that water heater didn't work. Now look at me, I'm this poor person who just paid all their money for this house and now I don't have a water heater that works. Okay. And so that's why home warranties came about, right? Is that, oh, well, for $400, we can kind of pay into this warranty system. And if anything like that happens, then I, as the seller, don't get a call from an attorney. I just know that they got their coverage through that and we're all good. Now, I know in practice, home warranties suck, right? They don't always pay out what we want them to. They Band-Aid a lot of the times. They're just not like this like miracle company that comes and just replaces all these water heaters or dishwashers or AC units, whatever. I get that. But they also do still do what they intended on doing all along, which was reduce liability for the seller and their agents, okay, the whole time, so that way then the buyer has some coverage from the very beginning. So I'll tell you, I still like it. I mark every single file, whether we have or have not opted in for the buyer to pay for it. I get that it does reduce your amount, like your overall net and those kind of things. It does reduce that for the seller. But gosh, to me, it's a really valid expense that it does get you something. It's not just a, wham bam expense. So I still like it. I'm going to say, hey, you should really think about it. Think about adding it in. Think about having your seller offer it even like in advance, like really figuring out how you want to attack that and go with that. And it may be having some conversations with some different home warranty companies about what they're offering now. And is it something that's good for your client? Cool. Okay. Number 8, brokers and sales agents. So this just is that language that was the same language from paragraph 4 saying, hey, Texas law requires that we disclose if it's spouse, parent, child, or business entity where the broker or the sales agent owns more than 10%, or a trust in which one of those people is the beneficiary, and then disclose as applicable. And then what was already in that paragraph is all obligations and payments for broker fees are contained in separate written agreements. So continuing to keep us out of the contract, we are not a party to the contract. This is just saying that if we are a party to the contract, we have to disclose it. Cool. That's a really easy change. Don't be afraid of that one for sure. All right, paragraph 9, closing. Closing will be on or before blank. Still the same language in there. No changes to that paragraph. I think we're all good on that. And then paragraph 10, possession. Seller shall deliver, and this gets back to Haley's point, seller shall deliver to buyer possession of the property in its present or required condition, ordinary wear and tear accepted. That's really all that it speaks to, how the condition is left and what things are left in the property. And so if there is some question of it, then that's where we would want to potentially enumerate that in paragraph 7D. I have been known to put something like professionally cleaned prior to occupancy or something like that into paragraph 7D if I am questioning how I think that property will be conveyed, because there's no real requirement for condition or like condition of the yard. I've had some properties that I go to final walkthrough and the yard is 2 feet high and I'm just so embarrassed, but it really doesn't say in the contract that that is not okay other than this part. And it's difficult to get the seller to really do things like that. And so if that is something that you need to enumerate, I would enumerate it in paragraph 7D or in an amendment. All right. And then possession is either upon closing and funding or according to temporary residential lease form promulgated by TREC. I'm not going to do the lease form here, but just know that is a big form for me. I want to make sure that you've got a good relationship with that other party and that you feel like that is really a necessary thing in order to make the deal done. I think we got into a position where we were just adding temporary leases on every deal because it was just easy and it made our offer look a little bit better. I would say, hey, we really need to talk to the other party about, do they really need a temporary lease, or is it something that we could get away without, because it is better for everybody if that buyer can see the property in its condition that they are buying it before closing. And it's just difficult to see that when their stuff is still in the property during the lease. Yep. Okay. And then paragraph 10B, really, that is where they were talking about leases. And so because they took that out and put that into paragraph 4, they've just excluded it here. So it's not It's not a scary change there. It's just they moved it over to paragraph 4. And then in paragraph 10C, this is where it's talking about smart devices and the obligation of the seller to turn off any access to smart devices at closing. Okay, so if you have a Ring doorbell, seller, it is your responsibility to turn off your access. Okay, this isn't like, it is very clear now, and it really has not been clear before. So I'm really glad that this is. Seller, you cannot still have a way to log in to that, whatever it is, sprinkler system. You have to fully log out. You have to erase the app. You have to get out of that. Ring doorbell, Nest, whatever. You cannot have anything that can control a smart device in that home after closing. You have given up ownership and you have to terminate all of that. Okay, and this just enumerates what that is. Cool. It's already dealt with prior in the deal about delivering the apps, delivering the passwords, delivering all that, like really all that's dealt with previously. Now we're dealing with, hey, seller, and you have the right, just like you have to give over the keys, you have to give over all of that now. Okay, so that's a new part, but it should be good. Okay, special provisions. So in this draft form, they made it even smaller, y'all. I mean, like comically small. I'm sure they will add like maybe 1 or 2 lines, but don't expect it to be real big. Settlement and other expenses, they didn't mess with this. So we're under the same provisions that we had before in paragraph 12A1B. This is a paragraph that is under a lot of scrutiny a lot of times. So I'm going to read it just because it's something that is fairly simple, but people don't read this part and then they come back and they don't know what it covers. So paragraph 12 is settlement and other expenses. A is the following expenses must be paid at or prior to closing. And then expenses paid by the seller, seller's expenses, it enumerates in that 1A what is going to be paid for by the seller regardless. Like these are the seller expenses. Then B is seller shall also pay an amount not to exceed blank to be applied in the following order. Buyer's expenses, which buyer is prohibited from paying by FHA, VA, or Texas Veterans Land Board or other governmental loan programs. And then to other buyer expenses as allowed by the lender. Buyer expenses are not their down payment. Buyer expenses are not repairs. They're not allowances for carpet. There's not anything. It is purely to go to closing costs. So like we had an offer that was submitted on one of our agent, it was one of, I don't know if she's here, but one of the agents had called me and said, hey, I got this offer from my seller and they put $25,000 in there. And I'm like, well, I mean, it's not a bad deal for your seller because there's no way the expenses are going to hit $25,000 on there because that's basically lender fees, right? It's insurance, it's lender fees, it's all the things that are set off in paragraph 12A2, all those expenses by the buyers, appraisal fees, loan application fees, well, all this stuff. But I mean, y'all, it's really hard to get $25,000 worth of stuff there. What the buyer's agent was attempting to do was to get enough money to pay for new flooring in the whole house. Well, you are limited to how much you can ask for there to the true expense of what the closing costs are for the buyer. If the buyer wants new flooring throughout the whole house, then we got to go back to that paragraph 7D and ask for the actual flooring to be replaced. Or you could add something into special provisions per se and say, hey, seller to provide buyer with check at closing for this much money. It's just the lender is likely going to kick it back. The lender wants to think that they are lending on this house that is pure and clean and perfect. Okay. And so they don't want to see an amount in lieu of repairs or a holdback for repairs, anything like that. And so that's why they use 12A1B, which is great up to that expense level. But if you've got more than $5,000 or $6,000 worth of repairs or whatever, y'all may have to figure out a different way to do that other than just throwing a number in there. Does that make sense? This is an old provision that we're kind of getting used to at this point. We've done it for a long time, but for those of y'all that haven't been around for a long time, this is something that is customarily used in the negotiation of repairs. I just always want to make sure everybody knows that it is limited to that amount. It is also limited on the amendment. If there is something written into the base contract, so let's say that we had negotiated $5,000 for closing cost help. So like we're offering $200, but the seller's paying $5,000 of our closing costs. and then we want an extra $1,000 because the repairs came in for whatever, then the amendment would need to say 6,000 because it replaces the amount in the base contract in paragraph 12A1B. Okay, not just 1,000. Cool. Okay. All right, we'll just continue rolling through this. Prorations, that's normally done by the title company. Casualty loss, luckily we don't have that a lot, but we do have it some. Default, paragraph 15. I'm going to read this paragraph because it is a very important paragraph of the contract, and it says, if buyer fails to comply with this contract, buyer will be in default. And seller may either enforce specific performance, seek other relief as may be provided by law, or both, or B, terminate this contract and receive the earnest money as liquidated damages, thereby releasing both parties from the contract. That's an either or. It's not an and or, it's an either or. And then seller, if seller fails to comply with this contract, seller will be in default and buyer may enforce specific performance, seek other relief as may be provided by law, or both, or B, terminate this contract and receive the earnest money, thereby releasing both parties from the contract. Okay, so it's either way on this. Specific performance is forcing the other side to go forward with the deal, and it's tough to get any judge to go along with that. It is possible, but it is tough. But that's where this whole releasing of earnest money becomes very important. If your party, whichever one you have, wants to enforce something more than just getting the earnest money back against the defaulting party, they should not sign the release of earnest money form, because if they sign that release of earnest money form, then what just happened? The part B of this, where they just terminated the contract and they lost all rights to go back after the other party. Now, I'm going to say that with a grain of salt. Maybe there are other rights. I'm not an attorney. There may be others, but the baseline of, hey, being able to, you have terminated the contract and released both parties from the contract. So it will be harder for their attorneys. So that's where they need to talk with an attorney if they are talking about wanting to go after the other party. And it's not, and y'all call me all the time like, hey, this guy wants to talk to an attorney. I'm like, great. They're like, oh, it seems bad. No, it's not bad. Yeah, they should do that. They should talk to an attorney because we can't help them. Like once we're talking about talking to an attorney, even talking about to an attorney, like we're out. We can't help. Like we're past the point of what we can do. And so, yeah, we need to get them with an attorney so that they can really figure out what their rights are under that paragraph, because it is real skinny, but it has a lot of power in that part. Cool. Okay. Mediation, attorney's fees. I'm going to skip down to escrow. Paragraph 18, escrow. The escrow, it determines that the escrow agent is not a party to the contract and does not have liability for performance or non-performance under the contract. And then they added this part and said, escrow agent may require any disbursement made in connection with this contract to be conditioned on an escrow agent's collection of good funds acceptable to the escrow agent. So basically that's their get out of jail free if the buyer's check bounces. Okay, so they've added that in there. And then they've added some language in here too that says, hey, we may want to take some authorized expenses out of the earnest money. Really what they are trying to do that is surveys are like the biggest offender on that, right? So let's say that we go under contracts, the contract calls for a new survey to be ordered, the title company orders a new survey, and then the contract terminates and it says that all of the earnest money is supposed to go back to this party, but it doesn't say anything about the survey. And there's still an open invoice for the survey out there and nobody is taking ownership of that invoice. This is now saying that, hey, if it was authorized in the contract, they're going to take it out of the earnest money before they disperse the earnest money back to the other parties. Really, it's probably how it always should have read. But just know that that's something that they will do. I think really that section is why they agreed to taking the option fee, because they really wanted to get that added in there. They might also start adding in some title company fees that were authorized expenses, but I don't know. We'll see. I'm waiting to see on that. Okay, representation. So this is just saying that everything represented in the contract is still due or is still true past the closing date. So this again is like where I get the question a lot, like, should my seller update a seller's disclosure or anything? Yeah, they really are required to update a seller's disclosure all the way through closing. So let's say that they are somebody that had a residential lease and now the seller just gave them the tenant just gave them notice that they are going to move out or whatever. That's stuff that you've still got to tell the buyer about all the way through. And then even potentially after, if you have any issues with it. Paragraph 20 is the federal tax requirements related to FERPTA. So normally the title company is going to handle that for us. Really, this is if the transaction is not closed at a title company, then that's where it would come in. Notices. All right, paragraph 21. We changed this one. I really wish they would just have taken out fax altogether, but they did not. But they at least made it where there's 2 lines now for email instead of just 1. Great. So I love this. This is where you as an agent need to put in your client's information. That's pretty easy, right? Oh, it's really easy. They just write in their email address, whether you're writing up the offer or you're receiving the offer and you're the listing agent, whichever. But make sure paragraph 21 is right. Like, y'all, what happens if you don't? Okay, so let's say that I'm the listing agent and I didn't want to go back and make that other party add that, or I didn't want to write it in because I was just busy, whatever. And so I just went ahead and let my seller sign it, and that ended up blank. And then the buyer wants to exercise their provision in paragraph 6D and try to terminate based on an old TXU easement that's along the back of the house. And they sent it to you. And you didn't know what to do with it. And so you didn't do anything with it. And then the contract terminates and the seller says, well, why didn't you do something with it? You're like, well, I thought the title company or somebody would do something with it. Well, no, you were the agent for the seller and the seller was not made aware of that because you got the information about it. And now because you didn't pass that on timely to the seller, which, you know, maybe you were in Mexico, maybe or whatever, you didn't pass it on. Now you're liable for it. Okay. I don't want you to ever be in that position. And y'all, what we just said about representations, that this contract lasts way beyond just the close time of 30 days, this contract can last forever. And if you don't have good data in there, if you don't have good content information for the seller, you are the agent for the seller forever. And so you've got to monitor that email address every single time you go to Mexico, forever, to make sure that no email came in related to this contract that you need to send over to the other party. It is a big, big, big deal to have your client's contact information in here. I don't know how else to say it other than like trying to scare you into that. Like, you really need to make sure that if it's your buyer, that your buyer's information is in there. If it's your seller, that your seller's information is in there. Otherwise, you are taking ownership of it. Now, a lot of you I see, in fact, actually, I saw it on Spencer's deal the other day, where it said CC Spencer at frontrec.com. You do not need that. Okay. And that muddies the waters on here, because then if you're being CC'd, well, did that count? Like, just don't put it on there. You are an agent for the client per per page 9, and you're going to get copied on it. Don't worry about things that are happening and you're not knowing about it. You will know, like, you will know if people are, and I just don't want any reason for you to be responsible for delivery of that information to the other party. Okay.
So, the other day, so I didn't put that on mine, but whenever my buyer took the earnest money, I never got a receipt for that. And I mentioned it to the other agent and he said, oh, well, that's because you didn't have your email address on 21.
No.
Paragraph 20.
That's inaccurate. I mean, that's that guy lying to you, but no, it's not. That's not true.
He acted like I just did something horrible.
No, that's him doing something. And I will tell you, this is business practices. This is what I recommend. You may go and, you know, move license to another company and they say, absolutely do not put your client's information in there. You're just giving them to the wolves. There's all these people that are going to contact them. Yeah, I mean, yes, would potentially the seller contact the buyer directly or whatever? Yeah, maybe that's going to happen. But in order to get me out of the monkey in the middle where I have to be responsible for getting all things forever and always to that, then I have to get out of that paragraph. Otherwise, I'm going to be in the middle of it. Now, I think is best practice for sure. And a lot of attorneys agree with me, but it's really more of protection for you than it's protection for the buyer. And there are just things like, I mean, the other agent is just not going to deliver it. Like, then I would say, okay, prove to me when you delivered that to my client. Send me when you sent that to them. Likely they can't. You know? Okay, this paragraph 2, keep in mind, if this is filled out correctly, which I hope that it is going forward, is that this is where important things are delivered, like terminations. Okay, if you are wanting to terminate right before 5 o'clock on an option fee or situation, you're representing the buyer and you send over termination only to the agent and not to the seller's email address in there, then you did not officially terminate the contract. Okay, so it does go both ways. You need to pay attention to this and you need to copy those people on everything. But that's also the blessing to this, right? Is that if you are the listing agent and you have now the email for the buyer, you can directly email and know, hey, I got the survey to them. Hey, I got the HOA information to them. Hey, I got the lease information to them. Copy their agent on it, of course. Copy the title. You're going to copy title, lender, everybody on there. But you're going to have gotten it directly to the buyer and you're going to have proof that you did that per your instruction in paragraph 21. Cool.
Let's say we're the selling agent and the buyer doesn't fill that in. And we've asked the agent to make sure they fill that in. Can we, I mean, we can't force them, right?
Yes, you can.
Oh, we can?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep, I would force them. Yep, it's really important. Now, I will tell you, this gets back to also like having good offer instructions, like really, maybe that is part of what you put out there on MLS, or maybe like when somebody is ready to write an offer, you have something that you send over with those leases, with everything that then now, hey, now you can write an offer on it. Oh.
Amy, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I have an offer right now that I'm putting through. The seller on TAD is the Quick Trip Marital Trust. So I asked the agent, do I just list that or do I list the seller's signature that's on the seller's disclosure, which is a lady who I'm assuming has the rights to sign for the trust. So he said, no, just put the QT.
Yeah.
So I put his email in that seller paragraph, the agent email. So
I would just leave it blank, really. If you don't have a seller information or you don't have like whichever information you're not representing and you don't have, just leave it blank. It's cool.
Okay,
because it's assumed to be the agent, right? I mean, if there's no contact information in there, then we go to page 9. So I think you're fine on that. I mean, I don't think it's like, horrible. Where I'm concerned about is our client. I want to make sure our client is protected. I want to make sure you're protected. And that's by having your client's information in there correctly.
Okay, well, I don't want to put him at risk either, but okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
On the seller's disclosure.
Can you get closer to your microphone? Sorry.
On the seller's disclosure, if something comes up and everything's told to the buyer and all that, but it wasn't put on the seller's disclosure at the very end on the day of closing, does that need to be revised still, even if the buyers have all the information?
If the buyer has the information, then they've been disclosed.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Anything else? Okay, that's a fun one. All right, paragraph 22. Really, this should be a very easy one, but y'all, people forget to check the box. And so even if you have like the amendment regarding residential leases done and you didn't check the box, it's really not deemed to be part of it. So we've got to make sure that the little box thing is checked. I know it seems like, of course, I'm going to remember that, but just really double check to make sure. I will tell you, that's why I still drag my signature blocks when I am sending an offer, so that I can double check that. Because I tell you, there's so many times that I'm dragging, I'm like, oh yeah, Amy, you forgot to put that in there. So I don't know, for me, that's just what helps me to have that one more double check on it. All right, paragraph 23 is gone because it's in paragraph 5, right? So we're good, doesn't need to be there, should be fine. And then they just moved up, so we don't have a paragraph 24 anymore. We just have paragraph 23. Same with the effective date where the broker will fill in the last date of final acceptance. And then we'll see what page this ends up in. I think it will end up as page 10 of an 11-page document. And so this one, they added team name. I guess, whatever. We'll see how that goes long term. Team name. And then this part down here where it says disclosure, I'm gonna read that. So they took out the part that said listing broker has agreed to pay the other broker blank, which was normally a percentage of the total list price when the seller's broker's fee is received. Escrow agent is authorized and directed to pay other broker from listing broker's fee at closing. Instead, they added and said disclosure pursuant to a previous separate agreement, such as MLS offer of compensation or other agreement between brokers. Listing broker has agreed to pay the other broker a fee of blank, potentially still a percentage of sales price. And so then it says this disclosure is for informational purposes, and does not change the previous agreement between brokers to pay or share a commission. All right. So what this is doing is trying to clarify. So what this is doing is trying to clarify that it is not whatever you put in there isn't what you'll actually get paid. It's being paid per a previous deal. So if MLS says 2% and you put 3% in here, that didn't do anything. It's what was in MLS. So this is just for informational purposes. Okay. It probably helps to clear that up so that way it's good. Any questions on that? Okay. And then they just changed on the option fee receipt for that to be done by escrow agent instead of by seller. Okay, let me just see if there was any other forms that we needed to go over. I was going to go over the backup contract and the addendum for sale of other property real quick, since those are always complicated, unless y'all want to talk about any of the other provisions or new parts or anything that you're confused about or anything on that first.
Hey, Amy?
Yes.
Can I be a little stupid here? I'm sorry, but that's when you went over, because we were told, or I was, that if you did not put that 3%, you would not get paid. But you're telling me that we don't have to put anything necessarily?
I would put in whatever you're planning on getting paid. So if it says 3% in MLS, put 3% there, still have that. But what that's saying though is like, you can't just will that to be 3% there. That's not a negotiation of commission. If you want a different commission that's different than what is set forth in the MLS agreement, which that's how we get paid, is what is that BAC in MLS. If you want something different, we've got to negotiate that in a separate agreement. So just that's the way it's always been. It just wasn't very clear before. All right, let's talk about backup just a little bit, just because it's a often confused form. So I'm just going to read through this one really quick. It says the contract to which this addendum is attached is called the backup contract. Is binding upon execution of the party, and the earnest money and any option fee must be paid as provided in the backup contract. So if you do a backup that is accepted, everybody agrees to it, we're in official backup position, then you've got to go ahead and deposit the earnest money and the option fee in order to do that. So a lot of times we may lower those amounts because that would be potentially burdensome on the buyer that may never go into first position to have lost that lost that option fee. Yes, they can get the earnest money refunded, but the option fee does not get refunded even if they never move into first position. And so then it says the backup contract is contingent upon termination of a previous contract, the first contract dated blank for sale of the property, except as provided by this addendum. Neither party is required to perform under the backup contract while it is contingent upon the termination of the first contract. And then it says, if the first contract does not terminate on or before blank, the backup contract terminates and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. The seller must notify buyer immediately of termination of the first contract. For purposes of performance, the effective date of the backup contract changes to the date the buyer receives notice of termination of the first contract. Okay, so that means that once you get notice that the first contract terminates, then now you count your days for third-party financing. Now you count your days for option. Now everything starts. You don't do any inspection or anything before you get to the first contract terminating, and then everything kicks off from there. And then it just says if the first contract is amended or modified, that doesn't change. Then it clarifies again, if there's the unrestricted right to terminate, that it starts after it moves into first position. And then it again says for this addendum, time is of the essence. Does anybody have any questions on backup or why we do it that way? I have some questions on.
With an amendment or somebody just
I'm sorry, Amanda, I'm not able to hear you. Could you say that one more time?
is a backup, it's only an official backup if it's sent with an addendum. Am I correct? Or can someone just say, I want this to be?
I'm sorry, I'm still not able to hear you. Can you say it one more time?
Yeah, as far as the backup, what makes it official? If someone sends in and says, hey, you know, let me know if something falls through, or if it's sent actually with an addendum.
If it's sent back with an addendum, then that's an official backup offer. And then it would be an official backup contract when all parties sign.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yep, good question. So I'll tell y'all, this is a great mechanism to get your buyers into houses. Like there might have been 20 offers on houses. In fact, actually Amanda just had one where she had like 35 offers on a house, but only got like 1 or 2, maybe like actual backup offers. And so you can go ahead and fully negotiate it out, and y'all, and then if anything happens, that first contract, if it terminates for any reason, you're already in, you are good to go. So it really can result in closings for you if you use this form right. It's tough because a buyer gets kind of emotionally involved and they're still in second position. So stuff. All right, so there's that one. And then I just wanted to go over one more time the sale of other property by buyer, because this one is often confused. Okay, and so this says that this contract is contingent upon buyer's receipt of proceeds from the sale of the buyer's property at blank on or before blank, and that's the contingency period. If the contingency is not satisfied or waived by the buyer by the above date, the contract will terminate automatically and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Y'all, automatically. So this is like a really big deal for the buyer to make sure that if they are getting this offer accepted by the seller and like they need a little bit extra time or they need some, like you've got to really make sure that y'all have pre-negotiated that, because otherwise this will just terminate. And if there was a backup, which likely there is, if this is a kick out offer, then that backup just went into first position. Okay. And then B, it says, if seller accepts a written offer to sell the property, seller shall notify buyer of such acceptance and that the seller requires buyer to waive the contingency. Buyer must waive the contingency on or before the blank day after seller's notice to buyer. Otherwise, the contract will terminate automatically and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. And then buyer may waive the contingency only by notifying the seller of the waiver and depositing blank with the escrow agent as additional earnest money. So if you're doing a contingency on the sale of their property, your buyer needs to know if the seller accepts any backup offer, then they're going to get notice and say, hey, within blank days, so maybe 3, I think 2 or 3 is really reasonable. 7 or 10 is really, to me, way too much. But then they can only keep the property if they waive the contingency and put down additional earnest money of whatever was previously negotiated there. So if I'm the seller and I'm going with a buyer, I want that to be heavy. I want them to really hurt if they are waiving the contingency and going forward with me, because they may not be able to close. Because what happens if their house doesn't close? They're not going to be able to close on this one, and I'm going to be left holding the bag. And so I love this form for a seller because it does give them some power to really get those other people out. I mean, the people with the contingency out if they need to, if the form is filled out correctly. So when I get an offer, this is going to be something that I'm going to highly negotiate, because I really want to make sure that this number of days in paragraph B is small and that the amount to be deposited is big, and that may not be how it comes over initially, and so that may need some negotiation on it. All right, we've covered a lot. You may have any questions on this form or any of the forms that we talked about today. I am like so impressed. Y'all are all my favorites for sticking with this whole dang class. Like, I love it. Y'all didn't even get TREC credit for it, but you got total brownie points from me. Y'all are awesome. I mean, it really is. Like, I don't think that these changes are that huge. Like, it's not those like really fundamental changes, but there are some pretty big changes in this contract going forward. And so it is just trying to figure out what's going to be the best, the best going forward for everybody. So anyway. All right.
Amy?
Yes.
So with the client I'm showing that house today, they do have another house to sell, or their home to sell. So I would use this addendum that we just went over.
Yes.
If we made an offer on that one.
Yes. Or talk with their lender about, is there an option for them to buy before they sell, or talk, and then talk with them about what risks there are involved with that. Like, do that.
Okay. Yeah, I just, they would prefer to have it like contingent, but I don't think it's not, for them. I don't think that's an issue the other way either. I think it's kind of just one of those we'd prefer.
Yeah. And they may prefer to offer, $10,000 under list and have that and not have this, and maybe the seller would take that too. That's what it's like. They have to kind of decide which way they want to go on negotiating, because it is going to limit their negotiating power to make a contingent offer.
Okay.
They don't have to. Anyway.
All right, that's something we can discuss with them today. All right, thank you.
Hey, Amy, one last question.
Yes.
Will this be recorded like under private listings on YouTube? Just so
yes. Yes. Yep.
Great.
Yeah, it will be. Good question. Anything else people are dealing with?
Amy, I had a question.
Yeah.
So I have some clients that are interested in land, and the listing comes up. When I pulled it up, it has it under type as commercial land. And it's like unpermitted. It's outside of city limits. So I see like horses are permitted and stuff like that. But when I go to the tax record, it does have it under farm and ranch. So I'm curious if they're expecting a commercial contract, or are they expect, I'm kind of confused on what they're expecting here.
Yeah, and that may be a good time to just open the line of communication and say, hey, I see you have it listed as commercial. What form are you expecting? Would you be open to just an unimproved property contract form, or what kind of is the expectation there? And they may have a specific reason why they thought the other one would work, but you could also combat it with, well, actually, I think it's better for this, or whatever. And really, it's a lot of times it's about talking with their lender if they're using financing, just to make sure that it comes in line. A lot of the forms can be interchanged when it comes to an improved property, farm and ranch. Like, a lot of those are kind of muddy. Like, it's not so clear that TREC has specific guidance on it definitely should be this, or it definitely should be this. So.
And I just kind of remembered something from like real estate school, because I remember that we had talked about rollback taxes on properties that are looked at as farm and ranch. And I know these people, like, they're literally trying to just live on the land. So I'm just like, I just want to make sure I kind of bring that up to them as something they should be aware of.
Yeah, and that may be one that they want to hire an attorney to really like research the property and tell them about what some of that is that's beyond what we might be able to get them. We can go kind of far, but ultimately some of the other may be beyond us. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, let me know if I can help with any of that. Cool. Any other questions? Y'all are so smart now. You've got all of these things. I'm so excited for you. So yeah, keep it up. All of these forms are out there on TREC now. So it's not like they're hiding them. It's just, you've got to just go and search them a little bit, and then you'll hear a lot more fanfare when they actually become live and that they're kind of the record, the form of choice going forward. So, all right. Good job, y'all. Have a great Monday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Later.
Thank you.